The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Part 2. Chapter 12. She was a true woman. Melbourne society was greatly agitated over the Hansom Cab murder. Before the assassin had been discovered, it had been looked upon merely as a common murder, and one of which society need take no cognizance beyond the bare fact of its committal. But now that one of the most fashionable young men in Melbourne had been arrested as the assassin, it bade fair to assume gigantic proportions. Mrs. Grundy was shocked, and openly talked about having nourished in her bosom a viper which had unexpectedly turned and stung her. Morn, noon, and night, in Toorak drawing rooms and Melbourne clubs, the case formed the principal subject of conversation. And Mrs. Grundy was horrified. Here was a young man, well born, the Fitzgeralds, my dear, an Irish family with royal blood in their veins, well-bred, most charming manners, I assure you, and so very good-looking and engaged to one of the richest girls in Melbourne. Pretty enough, madam, no doubt, but he wanted her money, sly dog. And this young man, who had been petted by the ladies, voted a good fellow by the men, and was universally popular. Both in drawing-room and club, had committed a vulgar murder. It was truly shocking. What was the world coming to? And what were jails and lunatic asylums built for if men of young Fitzgerald's caliber were not put in them and kept from killing people? And then, of course, everybody asked everybody else who White was and why he had never been heard of before. All people who had met Mr. White were worried to death with questions about him and underwent a species of social martyrdom as to who he was, what he was like, why he was killed, and all the rest of the insane questions which some people will ask. It was talked about everywhere, in fashionable drawing rooms at 5 o'clock tea, over thin bread and butter and sochong, at clubs over brandies and sodas and cigarettes, by working men over their midday pint, and by their wives in the congenial atmosphere of the backyard over the washtub. The papers were full of paragraphs about the famous murder, and the society papers gave an interview with the prisoner by their special reporters, which had been composed by those gentlemen out of the floating rumors which they heard around in their own fertile imaginations. As to the prisoner's guilt, everyone was certain of it. The cabman Royston had sworn that Fitzgerald had got into the cab with White, and when he got out, White was dead. There could be no stronger proof than that, and the general opinion was that the prisoner would put in no defense, but would throw himself on the mercy of the court. Even the church caught the contagion, and ministers, Anglican, Roman Catholic, and Presbyterian, together with the lesser lights of minor denominations, took the Hansom Cab murder as a text whereon to preach sermons on the profligacy of the age, and to point out that the only ark which could save men from the rising flood of infidelity and immorality was their own particular church. Gad, as Carlton remarked, after hearing 5 or 6 ministers each claim their own church as the one special vessel of safety, there seems to be a whole fleet of arks. For Mr. Felix Ralston, acquainted as he was with all concerned, the time was one of great and exceeding joy. He was ever to the fore in retailing to his friends, plus certain garnishments of his own, any fresh evidence that chanced to come to light. His endeavor was to render it the more piquant, if not dramatic. If you asked him for his definite opinion as to the innocence or guilt of the accused, Mr. Felix shook his head sagaciously, and gave you to understand that neither he, nor his dear friend Carlton, he knew Carlton to nod to, had yet been able to make up their minds about the matter. Fact is, don't you know, observed Mr. Ralston wisely, there's more in this than meets the eye, and all that sort of thing. Think 'tective feller's wrong myself. Don't think Fitz killed White. Jolly well sure he didn't. This would be followed invariably by a query in chorus of, who killed him then? Aha, Felix would retort, putting his head on one side, like a meditative sparrow. 'Tective fellers can't find out. That's the difficulty. Good mind to go on the prowl myself, by Jove. But do you know anything of the detective business? Someone would ask. Oh, dear yes, with an airy wave of his hand. I've read Gaboro, you know. Awfully jolly life, detectives. Despite this evasion, Ralston, in his heart of hearts, believed Fitzgerald guilty. But he was one of those persons who, having either tender hearts or obstinate natures, the latter is perhaps the more general, deem it incumbent upon them to come forward in championship of those in trouble. There are, doubtless, those who think that Nero was a pleasant young man, whose cruelties were but the resultant of an overflow of high spirits, and who regard Henry VIII in the light of a henpecked husband unfortunate in the possession of 6 wives. These people delight in expressing their sympathy with great scoundrels of the Ned Kelly order. They view them as the embodiment of heroism, unsympathetically and disgracefully treated by the narrow understanding of the law. If one half the world does kick a man when he is down, the other half invariably consoles the prostrate individual with halfpence. And therefore, even while the weight of public opinion was dead against Fitzgerald, he had his share of avowed sympathy. There was a comfort in this for Madge. Not that if the whole countryside had unanimously condemned her lover, she would have believed him guilty. The element of logic does not enter into the championship of woman. Her love for a man is sufficient to exalt him to the rank of a demigod. She absolutely refuses to see the clay feet of her idol. When all others forsake, she clings to him. When all others frown, she smiles on him. And when he dies, she reveres his memory as that of a saint and a martyr. Young men of the present day are prone to disparage their womenkind. But a poor thing is the man who in time of trouble has no woman to stand by him with cheering words and loving comfort. And so Madge Frettleby, true woman that she was, had nailed her colors to the mast. She refused surrender to anyone, or before any argument. He was innocent, and his innocence would be proved, for she had an intuitive feeling that he would be saved at the 11th hour. How? She knew not, but she was certain that it would be so. She would have gone to see Brian in prison, but that her father absolutely forbade her doing so. Therefore, she was dependent upon Carlton for all the news respecting him, and any message which she wished conveyed. Brian's persistent refusal to set up the defense of an alibi annoyed Carlton, the more so as he could conceive no reason sufficiently worthy of the risk to which it subjected his client. "If it's for the sake of a woman," he said to Brian, "I don't care who she is, it's absurdly quixotic. Self-preservation is the first law of nature, and if my neck was in danger I'd spare neither man, woman, nor child to save it." "I dare say," answered Brian, "but if you had my reasons you might think differently." Yet in his own mind the lawyer had a suspicion which he thought might perhaps account for Brian's obstinate concealment of his movements on the fatal night. He had admitted an appointment with a woman. He was a handsome young fellow, and probably his morals were no better than those of his fellows. There was perhaps some intrigue with a married woman. He had perchance been with her on that night, and it was to shield her that he refused to speak. Even so, argued Carlton, let him lose his character rather than his life. Indeed, the woman herself should speak. It would be hard upon her, I admit. Yet when a man's life is in danger, surely nothing should stop her. Full of these perplexing thoughts, Carlton went down to St. Kilda to have a talk with Madge. He intended to ask her to assist him towards obtaining the information he needed. He had a great respect for Madge and thought her a really clever woman. It was just possible, he argued, that Brian's great love might cause him to confess everything to her at her urgent request. He found Madge awaiting his arrival with anxiety. "Where have you been all this time?" she said as they sat down. "I have been counting every moment since I saw you last." "How is he?" "Just the same," answered Carlton, taking off his gloves, still obstinately refusing to save his own life. "Where's your father?" he asked suddenly. "Out of town," she answered impatiently. "He will not be back for a week." "But what do you mean that he won't save his own life?" Carlton leaned forward and took her hand. "Do you want to save his life?" he asked. "Save his life," she reiterated, starting up out of her chair with a cry. "God knows, I would die to save him." "Pish," murmured Carlton to himself, as he looked at her glowing face and outstretched hands. "These women are always in extremes." "The fact is," he said aloud, "Fitzgerald is able to prove an alibi, and he refuses to do so." "But why?" Carlton shrugged his shoulders. "That is best known to himself. Some quixotic idea of honor, I fancy. Now, he refuses to tell me where he was on that night. Perhaps he won't refuse to tell you. So you must come up and see him with me, and perhaps he will recover his senses and confess." "But my father," she faltered. "Did you not say he was out of town?" asked Carlton. "Yes," hesitated Madge. "But he told me not to go." "In that case," said Carlton, rising and taking up his hat and gloves, "I won't ask you." She laid her hand on his arm. "Stop. Will it do any good?" Carlton hesitated a moment, for he thought that if the reason of Brian's silence was, as he surmised, an intrigue with a married woman, he might not tell the girl he was engaged to about it. But, on the other hand, there might be some other reason, and Carlton trusted to Madge to find it out. With these thoughts in his mind, he turned round. "Yes," he answered, boldly, "it may save his life." "Then I shall go," she answered, recklessly. "He is more to me than my father, and if I can save him, I will." "Wait," and she ran out of the room. "An uncommonly plucky girl," murmured the lawyer, as he looked out of the window. "If Fitzgerald is not a fool, he will certainly tell her all. That is, of course, if he is able to queer things these women are. I quite agree with Balzac saying that no wonder man couldn't understand woman, seeing that God who created her failed to do so." Madge came back dressed to go out, with a heavy veil over her face. "Shall I order the carriage?" she asked, pulling on her gloves with trembling fingers. "Hardly," answered Carlton dryly, "unless you want to see a paragraph in the society papers to the effect that Miss Madge Frettleby visited Mr. Fitzgerald in jail. No, we'll get a cab. Come, my dear." And taking her arm, he led her away. They reached the station, and caught a train just as it started, yet notwithstanding this Madge was in a fever of impatience. "How slowly it goes," she said fretfully. "Hush, my dear," said Carlton, laying his hand on her arm. "You will betray yourself. We'll arrive soon, and save him." "Oh, God grant we may," she said with a low cry, clasping her hands tightly together, while Carlton could see the tears falling from under her thick veil. "This is not the way to do so," he said almost roughly. "You'll be in hysterics soon. Control yourself for his sake." "For his sake," she muttered, and with a powerful effort of will, calmed herself. They soon arrived in Melbourne, and, getting a hansom, drove up quickly to the jail. After going through the usual formula, they entered the cell where Brian was, and when the warder who accompanied them opened the door, they found the young man seated on his bed. He looked up, and on seeing Madge, rose and held out his hands with a cry of delight. She ran forward, and threw herself on his breast with a stifled sob. For a short time no one spoke, Carlton being at the other end of the cell, busy with some notes which he had taken from his pocket, and the warder having retired. "My poor darling," said Madge, stroking back the soft, fair hair from his flushed forehead. "How will you look?" "Yes," answered Fitzgerald, with a hard laugh. "Prison does not improve a man, does it?" "Don't speak in that tone, Brian," she said. "It is not like you. Let us sit down and talk calmly over the matter." "I don't see what good that will do," he answered, wearily, as they sat down hand in hand. "I have talked about it to Carlton till my head aches, and it is no good." "Of course not," retorted the lawyer, sharply, as he also sat down. "Nor will it be any good until you come to your senses, and tell us where you were on that night." "I tell you I cannot." "Brian, dear," said Madge softly, taking his hand, "you must tell all for my sake." Fitzgerald sighed. This was the hardest temptation he had yet been subjected to. He felt half inclined to yield and chance the result, but one look at Madge's pure face steeled him against doing so. What could his confession bring but sorrow and regret to one whom he loved better than his life? "Madge," he answered gravely, taking her hand again, "you do not know what you ask." "Yes, I do," she replied quickly. "I ask you to save yourself, to prove that you are not guilty of this terrible crime, and not to sacrifice your life for the sake of—" Here she stopped and looked helplessly at Carlton, for she had no idea of the reason of Fitzgerald's refusal to speak. "For the sake of a woman," finished Carlton bluntly. "A woman," she faltered, still holding her lover's hand. Is that the reason?" Brian averted his face. "Yes," he said, in a low, rough voice. A sharp expression of anguish crossed her pale face, and, sinking her head on her hands, she wept bitterly. Brian looked at her in a dogged kind of way, and Carlton stared grimly at them both. "Look here," he said at length to Brian, in an angry voice, "if you want my opinion of your conduct, I think it's infamous. Begging your pardon, Miss Frettleby, for the expression. Here is this noble girl, who loves you with her whole heart, and is ready to sacrifice everything for your sake, comes to implore you to save your life, and you coolly turn round and acknowledge another woman." Brian lifted his head haughtily, and his face flushed. You are wrong, he said, turning round sharply. There is the woman for whose sake I keep silence. And, rising up from the bed, he pointed to Madge as she sobbed bitterly on it. She lifted up her haggard face with an air of surprise. For my sake, she cried in a startled voice. Oh, he's mad, said Carlton, shrugging his shoulders. I shall put in a defense of insanity. No, I am not mad, cried Fitzgerald wildly as he caught Madge in his arms. My darling, it is for your sake that I keep silence, and I shall do so though my life pays the penalty. I could tell you where I was on that night and save myself. But if I did, you would learn a secret which would curse your life, and I dare not speak. I dare not. Madge looked up into his face with a pitiful smile as her tears fell fast. Dearest, she said softly, do not think of me, but only of yourself. Better that I should endure misery than that you should die. I do not know what the secret can be, but if the telling of it will save your life, do not hesitate. See, she cried, falling on her knees, I am at your feet. I implore you by all the love you ever had for me, to save yourself, whatever the consequences may be to me. Madge, said Fitzgerald, as he raised her in his arms, at one time I might have done so, but now it is too late. There is another and stronger reason for my silence, which I have only found out since my arrest. I know that I am closing up the one way of escape from this charge of murder, of which I am innocent. But as there is a God in heaven, I swear that I will not speak. There was a silence in the cell, broken only by Madge's convulsive sobs, and even Carlton, cynical man of the world as he was, felt his eyes grow wet. Brian led Madge over to him and placed her in his arms. Take her away, he said in a broken voice, or I shall forget that I am a man. And turning away, he threw himself on his bed and covered his face with his hands. Carlton did not answer him, but summoned the warder and tried to lead Madge away. But just as they reached the door, she broke away from him and, running back, flung herself on her lover's breast. My darling, she sobbed, kissing him, you shall not die. I shall save you in spite of yourself. And as if afraid to trust herself longer, she ran out of the cell, followed by the barrister. Chapter 13. Madge makes a discovery. Madge stepped into the cab, and Carlton paused a moment to tell the cabman to drive to the railway station. Suddenly, she stopped him. Tell him to drive to Brian's lodgings in Powlett Street, she said, laying her hand on Carlton's arm. What for? Asked the lawyer in astonishment. And also to go past the Melbourne Club, as I want to stop there. What the deuce does she mean? Muttered Carlton, as he gave the necessary orders and stepped into the cab. And now, he asked, looking at his companion, who had let down her veil, while the cab rattled quickly down the street. What do you intend to do? She threw back her veil, and he was astonished to see the sudden change which had come over her. There were no tears now, and her eyes were hard and glittering, while her mouth was firmly closed. She looked like a woman who had determined to do a certain thing, and would carry out her intention at whatever cost. I intend to save Brian in spite of himself, she said very distinctly. But how? You think that, being a woman, I can do nothing, she said bitterly. Well, you shall see. I beg your pardon, retorted Carlton with a grim smile. My opinion of your sex has always been an excellent one. Every lawyer's is. Stands to reason that it should be so, seeing that a woman is at the bottom of 9 cases out of 10. The old cry. Nevertheless a true one, answered Carlton. Ever since the time of Father Adam, it has been acknowledged that women influence the world either for good or evil more than men. But this is not to the point, he went on, rather impatiently. What do you propose to do? Simply this, she answered. In the first place, I may tell you that I do not understand Brian's statement that he keeps silence for my sake, as there are no secrets in my life that can justify his saying so. The facts of the case are simply these. Brian, on the night in question, left our house at St. Kilda at 11 o'clock. He told me that he would call at the club to see if there were any letters for him, and then go straight home, but he might have said that merely as a blind. Madge shook her head. No, I don't think so. I did not ask him where he was going. He told me quite spontaneously. I know Brian's character, and he would not tell a deliberate lie, especially when there was no necessity for it. I am quite certain that he intended to do as he said and go straight home. When he got to the club, he found a letter there which caused him to alter his mind. From whom was the letter? Can't you guess? She said impatiently. From the person, man or woman, who wanted to see him and reveal this secret about me, whatever it is. He got the letter at his club and went down Collins Street to meet the writer. At the corner of the Scotch church, he found Mr. White, and on recognizing him, left in disgust and walked down Russell Street to keep his appointment. Then you don't think he came back? I am certain he did not, for, as Brian told you, there are plenty of young men who wear the same kind of coat and hat as he does. Who the second man who got into the cab was I do not know, but I will swear that it was not Brian. And you're going to look for that letter? Yes, in Brian's lodgings. He might have burned it. He might have done 1,000 things, but he did not, she answered. Brian is the most careless man in the world. He would put the letter into his pocket or throw it into the wastepaper basket and never think of it again. In this case he did, however. Yes, he thought of the conversation he had with the writer, but not of the letter itself. Depend upon it, we shall find it in his desk or in one of the pockets of the clothes he wore that night. Then there's another thing, said Carlton, thoughtfully. The letter might have been delivered to him between the Elizabeth Street railway station and the club. We can soon find out about that, answered Madge, for Mr. Ralston was with him at the time. So he was, answered Carlton, and here is Ralston coming down the street. We'll ask him now. The cab was just passing the Burke and Wills monument, and Carlton's quick eye had caught a glimpse of Ralston walking down the left-hand side. What first attracted Carlton's attention was the glittering appearance of Felix. His well-brushed top hat glittered, his varnished boots glittered, and his rings and scarf pin glittered. In fact, so resplendent was his appearance that he looked like an animated diamond coming along in the blazing sunshine. The cab drove up to the curb, and Ralston stopped short as Carlton sprang out directly in front of him. Madge lay back in the cab and pulled down her veil, not wishing to be recognized by Felix, as she knew that if he did it would soon be all over the town. "Hello, old chap," said Ralston, in considerable astonishment. "Where did you spring from?" "From the cab, of course," answered Carlton, with a laugh. "A kind of deus ex machina," replied Ralston, attempting a bad pun. "Exactly," said Carlton. "Look here, Ralston. Do you remember the night of White's murder? You met Fitzgerald at the railway station?" "In the train," corrected Felix. Well, no matter, you came up with him to the club." "Yes, and left him there. Did you notice if he received any message while he was with you?" "Any message?" repeated Felix. "No, he did not. We were talking together the whole time, and he spoke to no one but me." "Was he in good spirits?" "Excellent. Made me laugh awfully. But why all this thusness?" "Oh, nothing," answered Carlton, getting back into the cab. "I wanted a little information from you. I'll explain next time I see you. Goodbye." "But I say," began Felix, but the cab had already rattled away, so Mr. Ralston turned angrily away. "I never saw anything like these lawyers," he said to himself. "Carlton's a perfect whirlwind, by Jove." Meanwhile, Carlton was talking to Madge. "You were right," he said. "There must have been a message for him at the club, for he got none from the time he left your place." "And what shall we do now?" asked Madge, who, having heard all the conversation, did not trouble to question the lawyer about it. "Find out at the club if any letter was waiting for him on that night," said Carlton, as the cab stopped at the door of the Melbourne Club. "Here we are," and with a hasty word to Madge, he ran up the steps. He went to the office of the club to find out if any letters had been waiting for Fitzgerald, and found there a waiter with whom he was pretty well acquainted. "Look here, Brown," said the lawyer. "Do you remember on that Thursday night when the Hansom Cab murder took place, if any letters were waiting here for Mr. Fitzgerald's?" "Well, really, sir," hesitated Brown. "It's so long ago that I almost forget." Carlton gave him a sovereign. "Oh, it's not that, Mr. Carlton," said the waiter, pocketing the coin nevertheless. "But I really do forget." "Try and remember," said Carlton shortly. Brown made a tremendous effort of memory, and at last gave a satisfactory answer. "No, sir, there were none." "Are you sure?" said Carlton, feeling a thrill of disappointment. "Quite sure, sir," replied the other, confidently. "I went to the letter rack several times that night, and I am sure there were none from Mr. Fitzgerald." "Ah, I thought as much," said Carlton. heaving a sigh. "Stop," said Brown, as though struck with a sudden idea. "Though there was no letter came by post, sir, there was one brought to him on that night." "Ah," said Carlton, turning sharply. "At what time?" "Just before 12 o'clock, sir." "Who brought it?" "A young woman, sir," said Brown, in a tone of disgust. "A bold thing, begging your pardon, sir, and no better than she should be. She bounced in at the door as bold as brass, and sings out, 'Is he in?' 'Get out,' I says, 'or I'll call the perlice.' 'Oh, no, you won't,' says she. 'You'll give him that,' and she shoves a letter into my hands. 'Who's him?' I asks. 'I dunno,' she answers. 'It's written there, and I can't read. Give it him at once.' And then she clears out before I could stop her. 'And the letter was for Mr. Fitzgerald?' 'Yes, sir. And a precious dirty letter it was, too.' 'You gave it to him, of course?' 'I did, sir. He was playing cards, and he put it in his pocket, after having looked at the outside of it, and went on with his game.' 'Didn't he open it?' 'Not then, sir, but he did later on, about 1:15 o'clock. I was in the room, and he opens it and reads it. Then he says to himself, 'What d impertinence,' and puts it into his pocket. Was he disturbed? Well, sir, he looked angry-like and put his coat and hat on and walked out about 5 minutes to 1. "Ah, and he met White at 1, muttered Carlton. "There's no doubt about it. The letter was an appointment, and he was going to keep it." "What kind of letter was it?" he asked. "Very dirty, sir, in a square envelope. But the paper was good, and so was the writing." "That will do," said Carlton. "I am much obliged to you." And he hurried down to where Madge awaited him in the cab. "You were right," he said to her, when the cab was once more in motion. "He got a letter on that night, and went to keep his appointment at the time he met White." "I knew it," cried Madge with delight. "You see, we will find it in his lodgings." "I hope so," answered Carlton, "but we must not be too sanguine. He may have destroyed it." "No, he is not," she replied. "I am convinced it is there." "Well," answered Carlton, looking at her, "I don't contradict you, for your feminine instincts have done more to discover the truth than my reasonings. But that is often the case with women. They jump in the dark where a man would hesitate, and in 9 cases out of 10 land safely." "Alas for the 10th," said Miss Frettleby. "She has to be the one exception to prove the rule." She had in a great measure recovered her spirits, and seemed confident that she would save her lover. But Mr. Carlton saw that her nerves were strung up to the highest pitch, and that it was only her strong will that kept her from breaking down altogether. "By Jove," he muttered, in an admiring tone, as he watched her. "She's a plucky girl, and Fitzgerald is a lucky man to have the love of such a woman." They soon arrived at Brian's lodgings, and the door was opened by Mrs. Sampson, who looked very disconsolate indeed. The poor cricket had been blaming herself severely for the information she had given to the false insurance agent, and the floods of tears which she had wept had apparently had an effect on her physical condition, for she crackled less loudly than usual, though her voice was as shrill as ever. "That such a thing should ave appean to him," she wailed in her thin, high voice. "And me that proud of him, not even any family of my own, except one as died and went up to even arter his father, which I hopes as they both are now angels, and friendly, as his nature had not developed in this valley of the shadow to determine, his feelings towards his father, when he died, being carried off by a chill, caused by the change from hot to cold, the weather being that contrary." They had arrived in Brian's sitting-room by this time, and Madge sank into a chair, while Carlton, anxious to begin the search, hinted to Mrs. Sampson that she could go. "I'm departin', sir," piped the cricket with a sad shake of her head as she opened the door, "knowing, as I do, as ease is innocent as an unborn babe, and to think of me even told that 'orrid poosin who had no regard for the truth all about him as is now in a cold cell, not as what the weather ain't warm, and he won't want a fire as long as they allows him blankets.'" "What did you tell him?" asked Carlton sharply. "Ah, you may well say that," lamented Mrs. Sampson, rolling her dingy handkerchief into a ball, and dabbing at her red-rimmed eyes, which presented quite a bacchanalian appearance, due, be it said in justice, to grief, not to liquor. "Avin been beguiled by that serping in light clothes as wanted to know if he allays come 'ome afore 12, which I said he was in that a bit of doin', though, to be sure, he did sometimes use his latchkey. The night of the murder, for instance." "Oh, don't say that, sir," said Mrs. Sampson, with a terrified crackle. "Me bein' weak and Eileen, though comin' of a strong family, as allays lived to a good age, through bein' in it a bit of wearin' flannels, which my mother's father thought better nor a spilin' the inside with chemistry." "Clever man, that detective," murmured Carlton to himself. He got out of her by strategy what he never would have done by force. It's a strong piece of evidence against Fitzgerald, but it does not matter much if he can prove an alibi. "You'll likely be called as a witness for the prosecution," he said aloud. "Me, sir," squeaked Mrs. Sampson, trembling violently, and thereby producing a subdued rustle, as of wind in the trees. "As I've never been in the court, 'cept the time his father took me for a treat, to 'ear a murder, which there's no denying is as good as a play, bein', aven, it his wife over the with the poker when she weren't looking, and buryin' her corpse in a back garden, without even a stone to mark the place, let alone a line from the Psalms, and a remuneration of her virtues." Well, said Carlton, rather impatiently, as he opened the door for her. "Leave us for a short time. There's a good soul, Miss Frettleby, and I want to rest, and we will ring for you when we are going." "Thank you, sir," said the lachrymose landlady, "and I hopes they won't ong him, which is sich a choky way of dying. But in life we are in death," she went on, rather incoherently, "as is well known to them as diseases, and may be corpsed at any minute, and as—" Here Carlton, unable to restrain his impatience any longer, shut the door, and they heard Mrs. Sampson's shrill voice and subdued cracklings die away in the distance. "Now then," he said, "now that we have got rid of that woman and her tongue, where are we to begin?" "The desk," replied Madge, going over to it. "It's the most likely place." "Don't think so," said Carlton, shaking his head. "If, as you say, Fitzgerald is a careless man, he would not have troubled to put it there. However, perhaps we'd better look." The desk was very untidy, just like Brian, as Madge remarked, full of paid and unpaid bills, old letters, playbills, ball programs, and withered flowers. "Reminiscences of former flirtations," said Carlton, with a laugh, pointing to these. "I should not wonder," retorted Miss Frettleby, coolly. "Brian always was in love with some one or other. But you know what Linton says, there are many counterfeits, but only one Eros, so I can afford to forget these things." The letter, however, was not to be found in the desk, nor was it in the sitting room. They tried the bedroom, but with no better result. Madge was about to give up the search in despair, when suddenly Carlton's eye fell on the wastepaper basket, which, by some unaccountable reason, they had overlooked. The basket was half full, in fact, more than half, and on looking at it, a sudden thought struck the lawyer. He rang the bell, and presently Mrs. Sampson made her appearance. "How long has that wastepaper basket been standing like that?" he asked, pointing to it. "It bein' the only fault I 'ad to find with him," said Mrs. Sampson. "He bein' that untidy that he never let me clean it out until he told me pussonly. He said as 'ow be throwed things into it as he might ave to look up again. And I haven't touched it for more nor 6 weeks. Pin, you won't think me a bad 'ousekeeper, it bein' his own wish bein' fond of litter and sich like." "6 weeks," repeated Carlton, with a look at Madge. "Ah, and he got the letter 4 weeks ago. Depend upon it, we shall find it there." Madge gave a cry, and falling on her knees, emptied the basket out on the floor, and both she and Carlton were soon as busy among the fragments of paper as though they were rag pickers. "Pin, they ain't orf their eads," murmured Mrs. Sampson, as she went to the door, "but it looks like it they be in." Suddenly a cry broke from Madge, as she drew out of the mass of paper a half-burnt letter, written on thick and creamy-looking paper. "At last," she cried, rising off her knees and smoothing it out. "I knew he had not destroyed it." "Pretty nearly, however," said Carlton, as his eye glanced rapidly over it. "It's almost useless as it is. There's no name to it." He took it over to the window and spread it out upon the table. It was dirty and half-burnt, but still it was a clue. The above is a facsimile of the letter. "There is not much to be gained from that, I'm afraid," said Madge sadly. "It shows that he had an appointment. But where?" Carlton did not answer, but, leaning his head on his hands, stared hard at the paper. At last he jumped up with a cry. I have it, he said in an excited tone. Look at that paper. See how creamy and white it is. And above all, look at the printing in the corner. OT Villa, Toorak. Then he went down to Toorak? In an hour, and back again. Hardly. Then it was not written from Toorak? No, it was written in one of the Melbourne back slums. How do you know? Look at the girl who brought it, said Carlton quickly. A disreputable woman. One far more likely to come from the back slums than from Toorak. As to the paper, 3 months ago, there was a robbery at Toorak, and this is some of the paper that was stolen by the thieves. Madge said nothing, but her sparkling eyes and the nervous trembling of her hands showed her excitement. I will see a detective this evening, said Carlton, exultingly. Find out where this letter came from and who wrote it. We'll save him yet, he said, placing the precious letter carefully in his pocketbook. You think that you will be able to find the woman who wrote that? Said the lawyer, looking thoughtful. She may be dead, as the letter says she is in a dying condition. However, if I can find the woman who delivered the letter at the club and who waited for Fitzgerald at the corner of Burke and Russell Streets, that will be sufficient. All I want to prove is that he was not in the hansom cab with White. And do you think you can do that? Depends upon this letter, said Carlton, tapping his pocketbook with his finger. I'll tell you tomorrow. Shortly afterwards they left the house, and when Carlton put Madge safely into the street-Kilda train, her heart felt lighter than it had done since Fitzgerald's arrest. Chapter 14. Another Richmond, Indiana, the field. There is an old adage that says, like draws to like. The antithesis of this is probably that unlike repels unlike. But there are times when individualism does not enter into the matter, and fate alone, by throwing two persons together, sets up a state, congenial or uncongenial, as the case may be. Fate chose to throw together Mr. Gorby and Mr. Kilsip, and each was something more than uncongenial to the other. Each was equally clever in their common profession. Each was a universal favorite, yet each hated the other. They were as fire and water to one another, and when they came together, invariably there was trouble. Kilsip was tall and slender. Gorby was short and stout. Kilsip looked clever. Gorby wore a smile of self-satisfaction, which alone was sufficient to prevent his doing so. Yet, singularly enough, it was this very smile that proved most useful to Gorby in the pursuit of his calling. It enabled him to come at information where his sharp-looking colleague might try in vain. The hearts of all went forth to Gorby's sweet smile and insinuating manner. But when Kilsip appeared, people were wont to shut up and to retire promptly, like alarmed snails within their shells. Gorby gave the lie direct to those who hold that the face is ever the index to the mind. Kilsip, on the other hand, with his hawk-like countenance, his brilliant black eyes, hooked nose, and small thin-lipped mouth, endorsed the theory. His complexion was quite colorless, and his hair was jet black. Altogether, he could not be called fair to look upon. His craft and cunning were of the snake-like order. So long as he conducted his inquiries in secret, he was generally successful. But once let him appear personally on the scene, and failure was assured to him. Thus, while Kilsip passed as the cleverer, Gorby was invariably the more successful, at all events ostensibly. When, therefore, this hansom cab murder case was put into Gorby's hands, the soul of Kilsip was smitten with envy. And when Fitzgerald was arrested, and all the evidence collected by Gorby seemed to point so conclusively to his guilt, Kilsip writhed in secret over the triumph of his enemy. Though he would only have been too glad to say that Gorby had got hold of the wrong man, yet the evidence was so conclusive that such a thought never entered his head until he received a note from Mr. Carlton, asking him to call at his office that evening at 8 o'clock with reference to the murder. Kilsip knew that Carlton was counsel for the prisoner. He guessed that he was wanted to follow up a clue, and he determined to devote himself to whatever Carlton might require of him, if only to prove Gorby to be wrong. So pleased was he at the mere possibility of triumphing over his rival, that on casually meeting him, he stopped and invited him to drink. The primary effect of his sudden and unusual hospitality was to arouse all Gorby's suspicions. But on second thoughts, deeming himself quite a match for Kilsip, both mentally and physically, Gorby accepted the invitation. "Ah," said Kilsip in his soft, low voice, rubbing his lean white hands together, as they sat over their drinks. "You're a lucky man to have laid your hands on that hansom cab murderer so quickly." "Yes, I flatter myself I did manage it pretty well," said Gorby, lighting his pipe. "I had no idea that it would be so simple. Though, mind you, it required a lot of thought before I got a proper start." "I suppose you're pretty sure he's the man you want?" pursued Kilsip, softly, with a brilliant flash of his black eyes. "Pretty sure indeed," retorted Mr. Gorby, scornfully. "There ain't no pretty sure about it. I take my Bible oath he's the man. He and White hated one another. He says to White, 'I'll kill you if I've got to do it in the open street.' He meets White drunk, a fact which he acknowledges himself. He clears out, and the cabman swears he comes back. Then he gets into the cab with a living man, and when he comes out, leaves a dead one. He drives to East Melbourne and gets into the house at a time which his landlady can prove, just the time that a cab would take to drive from the grammar school on the St. Kilda Road. If you ain't a fool, Kilsip, you'll see as there's no doubt about it." "It looks all square enough," said Kilsip, who wondered what evidence Carlton could have found to contradict such a plain statement of fact. "And what's his defense?" "Mr. Carlton's the only man as knows that," answered Gorby, finishing his drink. "But clever and all as he is, he can't put anything in that can go against my evidence." "Don't you be too sure of that," sneered Kilsip, whose soul was devoured with envy. "Oh, but I am," retorted Gorby, getting as red as a turkey cock at the sneer. "You're jealous, you are, because you haven't got a finger in the pie." "Ah, but I may have yet." "Going a-hunting yourself, are you?" said Gorby, with an indignant snort. "A-hunting for what? For a man as is already caught?" "I don't believe you've got the right man," remarked Kilsip deliberately. Mr. Gorby looked upon him with a smile of pity. "No, of course you don't, just because I've caught him. Perhaps, when you see him hanged, you'll believe it then." "You're a smart man, you are," retorted Kilsip, "but you ain't the Pope to be infallible." "And what grounds have you for saying he's not the right man?" demanded Gorby. Kilsip smiled and stole softly across the room like a cat. "You don't think I'm such a fool as to tell you? But you ain't so safe nor clever as you think." And, with another irritating smile, he went out. "He's a regular snake," said Gorby to himself, as the door closed on his brother detective. "But he's bragging now. There isn't a link missing in the chain of evidence against Fitzgerald, so I defy him. He can do his worst." At 8 o'clock on that night, the soft-footed and soft-voiced detective presented himself at Carlton's office. He found the lawyer impatiently waiting for him. Kilsip closed the door softly, and then taking a seat opposite to Carlton, waited for him to speak. The lawyer, however, first handed him a cigar, and then producing a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses from some mysterious recess, he filled one and pushed it towards the detective. Kilsip accepted these little attentions with the utmost gravity, yet they were not without their effect on him, as the keen-eyed lawyer saw. Carlton was a great believer in diplomacy and never lost an opportunity of inculcating it into young men starting in life. "Diplomacy," said Carlton to one young aspirant for legal honors, "is the oil we cast on the troubled waters of social, professional, and political life. And if you can, by a little tact, manage mankind, you are pretty certain to get on in this world." Carlton was a man who practiced what he preached. He believed Kilsip to have that feline nature, which likes to be stroked, to be made much of, and he paid him these little attentions, knowing full well they would bear their fruit. He also knew that Kilsip entertained no friendly feeling for Gorby, that in fact he bore him hatred, and he determined that this feeling which existed between the two men should serve him to the end he had in view. "I suppose," he said, leaning back in his chair and watching the wreaths of blue smoke curling from his cigar, "I suppose you know all the ins and the outs of the Hansom Cab murders?" "I should rather think so," said Kilsip, with a curious light in his queer eyes. "Why, Gorby does nothing but brag about it, and his smartness in catching the supposed murderer." "Ah," said Carlton, leaning forward and putting his arms on the table. "Supposed murderer. Does that mean that he hasn't been convicted by a jury, or that you think that Fitzgerald is innocent?" Kilsip stared hard at the lawyer in a vague kind of way, slowly rubbing his hands together. "Well," he said at length in a deliberate manner, "before I got your note, I was convinced Gorby had got hold of the right man, but when I heard that you wanted to see me, and knowing you were defending the prisoner, I guess that you must have found something in his favor which you wanted me to look after." "Right," said Carlton laconically. "As Mr. Fitzgerald said, he met White at the corner and hailed the cab," went on the detective. "How do you know that?" interrupted Carlton sharply. "Gorby told me." "How the devil did he find out?" cried the lawyer with genuine surprise. "Because he is always poking and prying about," said Kilsip, forgetting, in his indignation, that such poking and prying formed part of detective business. "But, at any rate," he went on quickly, "if Mr. Fitzgerald did leave Mr. White, the only chance he's got of proving his innocence is that he did not come back, as the cabman alleged." "Then I suppose you think that Fitzgerald will prove an alibi," said Carlton. "Well, sir," answered Kilsip, modestly, "of course you know more about the case than I do, but that is the only defense I can see he can make." "Well, he's not going to put in such a defense." "Then he must be guilty," said Kilsip promptly. "Not necessarily," returned the barrister drily. "But if he wants to save his neck, he'll have to prove an alibi," persisted the other. "That's just where the point is," answered Carlton. "He doesn't want to save his neck." Kilsip, looking rather bewildered, took a sip of whiskey and waited to hear what Mr. Carlton had to say. "The fact is," said Carlton, lighting a fresh cigar, "he has some extraordinary idea in his head. He refuses absolutely to say where he was on that night." "I understand," said Kilsip, nodding his head. "Woman?" "No, nothing of the kind," retorted Carlton hastily. "I thought so at first, but I was wrong. He went to see a dying woman who wished to tell him something." "What about?" "That's just what I can't tell you," answered Carlton quickly. "It must have been something important, for she sent for him in great haste, and he was by her bedside between the hours of 1 and 2 on Friday morning." "Then he did not return to the cabs?" "No, he did not. He wanted to keep his appointment, but for some reason or other, he won't tell where this appointment was. I went to his rooms today and found this half-burnt letter asking him to come." Carlton handed the letter to Kilsip, who placed it on the table and examined it carefully. "This was written on Thursday," said the detective. "Of course, you can see that from the date. And White was murdered on Friday, the 27th. It was written at something Villa, Toorak," pursued Kilsip, still examining the paper. "Oh, I understand. He went down there?" "Hardly," retorted Carlton in a sarcastic tone. "He couldn't very well go down there, have an interview, and be back in East Melbourne in 1 hour. The cabman Royston can prove that he was at Russell Street at 1 o'clock, and his landlady that he entered his lodging in East Melbourne at 2. No, he wasn't at Toorak." "When was this letter delivered?" "Shortly before 12 o'clock, at the Melbourne Club, by a girl, who, from what the waiter saw of her, appears to be a disreputable individual. You will see it says bearer will wait him at Burke Street, and as another street is mentioned, and as Fitzgerald, after leaving White, went down Russell Street to keep his appointment. The most logical conclusion is that the bearer of the letter waited for him at the corner of Burke and Russell Streets. Now," went on the lawyer, "I want to find out who the girl that brought the letter is." "But how?" "God bless my soul, Kilsip, how stupid you are," cried Carlton, his irritation getting the better of him. "Can't you understand? That paper came from one of the back slums. Therefore, it must have been stolen." A sudden light flashed into Kilsip's eyes. "Talbot Villa, Toorak," he cried quickly, snatching up the letter again and examining it with great attention, "where that burglary took place." "Exactly," said Carlton, smiling complacently. "Now do you understand what I want? You must take me to the crib in the back slums where the articles stolen from the house in Toorak were hidden. This paper," pointing to the letter, "is part of the swag left behind and must have been used by someone there. Brian Fitzgerald obeyed the directions given in the letter, and he was there at the time of the murder." "I understand," said Kilsip with a gratified purr. "There were 4 men engaged in that burglary, and they hid the swag at Mother Guttersnipe's crib in a lane off Little Burke Street. But hang it, a swell like Mr. Fitzgerald, in evening dress, couldn't very well have gone down there unless he had someone with him well known in the locality," finished Carlton rapidly. "Exactly. That woman who delivered the letter at the club guided him. Judging from the waiter's description of her appearance, I should think she was pretty well known about the slums." "Well," said Kilsip, rising and looking at his watch, "it is now 9 o'clock, so if you like we will go to the old hag's place at once. Dying woman," he said as if struck by a sudden thought. There was a woman who died there about 4 weeks ago. Who was she? Asked Carlton, who was putting on his overcoat. Some relation of Mother Guttersnipe's, I fancy, answered Kilsip as they left the office. I don't know exactly what she was. She was called the Queen, and a precious handsome woman she must have been. Came from Sydney about 3 months ago, and from what I can make out, was not long from England, died of consumption on the Thursday night before the murder. Chapter 15. A Woman of the People. Burke Street is a more crowded thoroughfare than Collins Street, especially at night. The theaters that it contains are in themselves sufficient for the gathering of a considerable crowd. It is a grimy crowd for the most part. Round the doors of the hotels a number of ragged and shabby-looking individuals collect, waiting till some kind friend shall invite them to step inside. Further on, a knot of horsey-looking men are to be seen standing under the Opera House veranda giving and taking odds about the Melbourne Cup or some other meeting. Here and there are ragged street Arabs selling matches and newspapers, and against the veranda post, in the full blaze of the electric light, leans a weary, draggled-looking woman, one arm clasping a baby to her breast, and the other holding a pile of newspapers, while she drones out in a hoarse voice, "Herald, 3rd edition, 1 penny," until the ear wearies of the constant repetition. Cabs rattle incessantly along the street. Here, a fast-looking hansom, with a rakish horse, bearing some gilded youth to his club. There, a dingy-looking vehicle, drawn by a lank quadruped, which staggers blindly down the street. Alternating with these, carriages dash along with their well-groomed horses, and within, the vision of bright eyes, white dresses, and the sparkle of diamonds. Then, further up, just on the verge of the pavement, 3 violins and a harp are playing a German waltz to an admiring crowd of attentive spectators. If there is one thing which the Melbourne folk love more than another, it is music. Their fondness for it is only equaled by their admiration for horse racing. Any street band which plays at all decently may be sure of a good audience and a substantial remuneration for their performance. Some writer has described Melbourne as Glasgow with the sky of Alexandria, and certainly the beautiful climate of Australia, so Italian in its brightness, must have a great effect on the nature of such an adaptable race as the Anglo-Saxon. In spite of the dismal prognostications of Marcus Clarke regarding the future Australian, whom he describes as being a tall, coarse, strong-jawed, greedy, pushing, talented man, excelling in swimming and horsemanship, it is more likely that he will be a cultured, indolent individual with an intense appreciation of the arts and sciences and a dislike to hard work and utilitarian principles. Climatic influence should be taken into account with regard to the future Australian, and our posterity will no more resemble us than the luxurious Venetians resembled their hardy forefathers, who first started to build on those lonely sandy islands of the Adriatic. This was the conclusion at which Mr. Carlton arrived as he followed his guide through the crowded streets, and saw with what deep interest the crowd listened to the rhythmic strains of Strauss and the sparkling melodies of Offenbach. The brilliantly lit street, with the never-ceasing stream of people pouring along, the shrill cries of the street Arabs, the rattle of vehicles, and the fitful strains of music, all made up a scene which fascinated him. And he could have gone on wandering all night, watching the myriad phases of human character constantly passing before his eyes. But his guide, with whom familiarity with the proletarians had, in a great measure, bred indifference, hurried him away to Little Burke Street, where the narrowness of the thoroughfare, with the high buildings on each side, the dim light of the sparsely scattered gas lamps, and the few ragged-looking figures slouching along, formed a strong contrast to the brilliant and crowded scene they had just left. Turning off Little Burke Street, the detective led the way down a dark lane. It was as hot as a furnace from the accumulated heat of the day. To look up at the clear starlit sky was to experience a sensation of delicious coolness. "Keep close to me," whispered Kilsip, touching the barrister on the arm. "We may meet some nasty customers about here." It was not quite dark, for the atmosphere had that luminous kind of haze so observable in Australian twilights, and this weird light was just sufficient to make the darkness visible. Kilsip and the barrister kept for safety in the middle of the alley, so that no one could spring upon them unaware, and they could see sometimes on the one side a man cowering back into the black shadow, or on the other, a woman with disordered hair and bare bosom, leaning out of a window, trying to get a breath of fresh air. There were also some children playing in the dried-up gutter, and their shrill young voices came echoing strangely through the gloom, mingling with a bacchanalian sort of song, sung by a man as he slouched along unsteadily over the rough stones. Now and then a mild-looking string of Chinamen stole along, clad in their dull-hued blue blouses, either chattering shrilly, like a lot of parrots, or moving silently down the alley with a stolid oriental apathy on their yellow faces. Here, and there came a stream of warm light through an open door, and within, the Mongolians were gathered round the gambling tables, playing fan-tan, or leaving the seductions of their favorite pastime, to glide soft-footed to the many cook shops, where enticing-looking fowls and turkeys already cooked were awaiting purchasers. Kilsip, turning to the left, led the barrister down another and still narrower lane, the darkness and gloom of which made the lawyer shudder, as he wondered how human beings could live in such murky places. At last, to Carlton's relief, for he felt somewhat bewildered by the darkness and narrowness of the lanes through which he had been taken, the detective stopped before a door, which he opened, and stepping inside, beckoned to the barrister to follow. Carlton did so, and found himself in a low, dark, ill-smelling passage. At the end a faint light glimmered. Kilsip caught his companion by the arm and guided him carefully along the passage. There was much need of this caution, for Carlton could feel that the rotten boards were full of holes, into which one or the other of his feet kept slipping from time to time, while he could hear the rats squeaking and scampering away on all sides. Just as they got to the end of this tunnel, for it could be called nothing else, the lights suddenly went out, and they were left in complete darkness. "Light that!" cried the detective in a peremptory tone of voice. "What do you mean by dousing the glim?" Thieves' argot was, evidently, well understood here, for there was a shuffle in the dark, a muttered voice, and someone lit a candle. Carlton saw that the light was held by an elfish-looking child. Tangled masses of black hair hung over her scowling white face. As she crouched down on the floor against the damp wall, she looked up defiantly, yet fearfully at the detective. "Where's Mother Guttersnipe?" asked Kilsip, touching her with his foot. She seemed to resent the indignity, and rose quickly to her feet. "Upstairs," she replied, jerking her head in the direction of the right wall. Following her direction, Carlton, his eyes now somewhat accustomed to the gloom, could discern a gaping black chasm, which he presumed was the stair alluded to. "You won't get much out of her tonight. She's going to start booze, she is." "Never mind what she's doing or about to do," said Kilsip, sharply. "Take me to her at once." The girl looked him sullenly up and down. Then she led the way into the black chasm and up the stairs. They were so shaky as to make Carlton fear they might give way. As they toiled slowly up the broken steps, he held tightly to his companion's arm. At last they stopped at a door through the cracks of which a faint glimmer of light was to be seen. Here the girl gave a shrill whistle, and the door opened. Still preceded by their elfish guide, Carlton and the detective stepped through the doorway. A curious scene was before them. A small square room with a low roof from which the paper mildewed and torn hung in shreds. On the left hand, at the far end, was a kind of low stretcher upon which a woman, almost naked, lay amid a heap of greasy clothes. She appeared to be ill, for she kept tossing her head from side to side restlessly, and every now and then sang snatches of song in a cracked voice. In the center of the room was a rough deal table, upon which stood a guttering tallow candle, which but faintly illuminated the scene, and a half-empty rectangular bottle of schnapps, with a broken cup beside it. In front of these signs of festivity sat an old woman with a pack of cards spread out before her, and from which she had evidently been telling the fortune of a villainous-looking young man who had opened the door, and who stood looking at the detective with no very friendly expression of countenance. He wore a greasy brown velvet coat, much patched, and a black wide-awake hat pulled down over his eyes. From his expression, so scowling and vindictive was it, the barrister judged his ultimate destiny to lie between Pentridge and the gallows. As they entered, the fortune-teller raised her head, and, shading her eyes with one skinny hand, looked curiously at the newcomers. Carlton thought he had never seen such a repulsive-looking old crone. And in truth, her ugliness was in its very grotesqueness well worthy the pencil of a door. Her face was seamed and lined with innumerable wrinkles, clearly defined by the dirt which was in them. Bushy gray eyebrows, drawn frowningly over two piercing black eyes, whose light was undimmed by age, a hooked nose, like the beak of a bird of prey, and a thin-lipped mouth devoid of teeth. Her hair was very luxurious and almost white, and was tied up in a great bunch by a greasy bit of black ribbon. As to her chin, Carlton, when he saw it wagging to and fro, involuntarily quoted Macbeth's lines, "Ye should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that ye are so." She was no bad representative of the weird sisters. As they entered, she eyed them viciously, demanding what the blazes they wanted. "Want your booze," cried the child, with an elfish laugh, as she shook back her tangled hair. "Get out, you whelp," croaked the old hag, shaking one skinny fist at her, "or I'll tear your word out." "Yes, she can go," said Kilsip, nodding to the girl. "And you can clear, too," he added, sharply, turning to the young man, who stood still holding the door open. At first he seemed inclined to dispute the detective's order, but ultimately obeyed him, muttering, as he went out, something about the blooming cheek of showin' Swell's Cove's cribs. The child followed him out, her exit being accelerated by Mother Guttersnipe, who, with a rapidity only attained by long practice, seized the shoe from one of her feet and flung it at the head of the rapidly retreating girl. "Wait till I catches yer, Lizzer," she shrieked with a volley of oaths. "I'll break yer for ye." Lizzer responded with a shrill laugh of disdain and vanished through the shaky door, which she closed after her. When she had disappeared, Mother Guttersnipe took a drink from the broken cup and, gathering all her greasy cards together in a businesslike way, looked insinuatingly at Carlton with a suggestive leer. "It's the future you want unveiled, dearie," she croaked, rapidly shuffling the cards. "An old mother, you'll tell." "No, she won't," interrupted the detective, sharply. "I've come on business." The old woman started at this and looked keenly at him from under her bushy eyebrows. "What avey the boys been up to now?" she asked, harshly. "There ain't no swag, ere this time." Just then the sick woman, who had been restlessly tossing on the bed, commenced singing a snatch of the quaint old ballad of Barbara Allen. "Oh, mither, Mac, my bed, and Mac, it's soft and narrow, since my true love died for me today. I'll die for him tomorrow." "Shut up, cuss you," yelled Mother Guttersnipe viciously, "or I'll knock your bloomin' idiorf," and she seized the square bottle as if to carry out her threat. But, altering her mind, she poured some of its contents into the cup and drank it off with avidity. "The woman seems ill," said Carlton, casting a shuddering glance at the stretcher. "So she are," growled Mother Guttersnipe, angrily. "She ought to be in Yarra Bend. She ought, instead of stoppin' Aaron singing them beastly things which makes my blood run cold." "Just ear her," she said, viciously, as the sick woman broke out once more. "A little did my mither think, when first she cradled me, I die, say, far away from home, upon a gallows tree." "Yah," said the old woman, hastily, drinking some more gin out of the cup. "She's allays talkin' of dyin' and gallers, as if they were nice things to jor about." "Who was that woman who died here 3 or 4 weeks ago?" asked Kilsip, sharply. "How should I know?" retorted Mother Guttersnipe, sullenly. "I didn't kill, or did I? It were the brandy she drank. She was allays drinkin', cuss her. Do you remember the night she died?" "No, I don't," answered the beldame, frankly. "I were drunk, blind, bloomin' blazin' drunk. S'elp me." "You're always drunk," said Kilsip. "What if I am?" snarled the woman, seizing her bottle. "You don't pay for it." "Yes, I'm drunk. I'm allays drunk. I was drunk last night, and the night before, and I'm going to get drunk tonight," with an impressive look at the bottle, "and tomorrow night, and I'll keep it up till I'm rotten in the grave." Carlton shuddered. So full of hatred and suppressed malignity was her voice, but the detective merely shrugged his shoulders. "More fool you," he said briefly. "Come now. On the night the Queen, as you call her, died, there was a gentleman came to see her." "So she said," retorted Mother Guttersnipe. "But, lor, I dunno anythin'. I were drunk." "Who said, the Queen?" "No, my grand arter sow." The Queen sent to fetch the toff to see cut lucky. Wanted to look at his work, I suppose, cuss him. And Sal priggied some paper from my box, she shrieked indignantly. Priggied at W and I were too drunk to stop The detective glanced at Carlton, who nodded to him with a gratified expression on his face. They were right as to the paper having been stolen from the villa at Toorak. You did not see the gentleman who came, said Kilsip, turning again to the old hag. Not I, cuss you, she retorted politely. He came about 1:30 in the morning, and you don't expect we can stop up all night, do ye? 1:30, repeated Carlton quickly. The very time? Is this true? Wish I may die if it ain't, said Mother Guttersnipe graciously. My granddaughter Sal can tell ye. Where is she? Asked Kilsip sharply. At this the old woman threw back her head and howled dismay. She's okated, she wailed, drumming on the ground with her feet. Gone and left her poor old grand and joined the army, cuss him, a comin' round in a spilin' business. Here the woman on the bed broke out again. Since the flowers o' the forest are a wed hour. Old your jor, yelled Mother Guttersnipe, rising and making a dart at the bed. I'll choke the life out ye, help me. Die want me to murder ye singin' and funeral things? Meanwhile the detective was talking rapidly to Mr. Carlton. The only person who can prove Mr. Fitzgerald was here between 1 and 2 o'clock, he said quickly, is Sal Rawlins, as everyone else seems to have been drunk or asleep. As she has joined the Salvation Army, I'll go to the barracks the first thing in the morning and look for her. I hope you'll find her, answered Carlton, drawing a long breath. A man's life hangs on her evidence. They turned to go, Carlton having first given Mother Guttersnipe some loose silver, which she seized on with an avaricious clutch. You'll drink it, I suppose, said the barrister, shrinking back from her. Very likely, retorted the hag, with a repulsive grin, tying the money up in a piece of her dress, which she tore off for the purpose. I'm a fortaying to the public ooze. I am, and it's the only pleasure I have in my life, cuss it. The sight of money had a genial effect on her nature, for she held the candle at the head of the stairs as they went down, so that they should not break their heads. As they arrived safely, they saw the light vanish, and heard the sick woman singing the last rose of summer. The street door was open, and after groping their way along the dark passage, with its pitfalls, they found themselves in the open street. Thank heaven, said Carlton, taking off his hat and drawing a long breath. Thank heaven we are safely out of that den. At all events, our journey has not been wasted, said the detective as they walked along. We found out where Mr. Fitzgerald was on the night of the murder, so he will be safe. That depends upon Sal Rawlins, answered Carlton gravely. But come, let us have a glass of brandy, for I feel quite ill after my experience of low life. Chapter 16. Missing. The next day, Kilsip called at Carlton's office late in the afternoon and found the lawyer eagerly expecting him. The detective's face, however, looked rather dismal, and Carlton was not reassured. Well, he said impatiently, when Kilsip had closed the door and taken his seat. Where is she? That's just what I want to know, answered the detective coolly. I went to the Salvation Army headquarters and made inquiries about her. It appears that she had been in the army as a hallelujah lass, but got tired of it in a week, and went off with a friend of hers to Sydney. She carried on her old life of dissipation, but ultimately, her friend got sick of her, and the last thing they heard about her was that she had taken up with a Chinaman in one of the Sydney slums. I telegraphed at once to Sydney and got a reply that there was no person of the name of Sal Rawlins known to the Sydney police, but they said they would make inquiries and let me know the result. Ah, she has, no doubt, changed her name, said Carlton, thoughtfully, stroking his chin. I wonder why. Wanted to get rid of the army, I expect, answered Kilsip drily. The straying lamb did not care about being hunted back to the fold. And when did she join the army? The very day after the murder. Rather sudden conversion? Yes, but she said the death of the woman on Thursday night had so startled her that she went straight off to the army to get her religion properly fixed up. The effects of fright, no doubt, said Carlton dryly. I've met a good many examples of these sudden conversions, but they never last long as a rule. It's a case of the devil was sick, the devil a monk would be, more than anything else. Good-looking, so I believe, replied Kilsip, shrugging his shoulders. Very ignorant. Could neither read nor write. That accounts for her not asking for Fitzgerald when she called at the club. She probably did not know whom she had been sent for. It will resolve itself into a question of identification, I expect. However, if the police can't find her, we will put an advertisement in the papers offering a reward and send out handbills to the same effect. She must be found. Brian Fitzgerald's life hangs on a thread, and that thread is Sal Rawlins. Yes, assented Kilsip, rubbing his hands together. Even if Mr. Fitzgerald acknowledges that he was at Mother Guttersnipe's on the night in question, she will have to prove that he was there, as no one else saw him. Are you sure of that? As sure as anyone can be in such a case. It was a late hour when he came, and everyone seems to have been asleep except the dying woman and Sal. And as one is dead, the other is the only person that can prove that he was there at the time when the murder was being committed in the Hansom. And Mother Guttersnipe was drunk, as she acknowledged last night. She thought that if a gentleman did call, it must have been the other one. The other one? Repeated Carlton in a puzzled voice. What other one? Oliver White. Carlton arose from his seat with a blank air of astonishment. Oliver White, he said, as soon as he could find his voice. Was he in the habit of going there? Kilsip curled himself up in his seat like a sleek cat, and pushing forward his head till his nose looked like the beak of a bird of prey, looked keenly at Carlton. Look here, sir, he said in his low, purring voice, there's a good deal in this case which don't seem plain. In fact, the further we go into it, the more mixed up it seems to get. I went to see Mother Guttersnipe this morning, and she told me that White had visited the Queen several times while she lay ill, and that he seemed to be pretty well acquainted with her. But who the deuce is this woman they call the Queen? Said Carlton, irritably. She seems to be at the bottom of the whole affair. Every path we take leads to her. I know hardly anything about her, replied Kilsip, except that she was a good-looking woman of about 49. She came out from England to Sydney a few months ago, then on here. How she got a Mother Guttersnipe's I can't find out, though I've tried to pump that old woman. But she's as close as wax, and it's my belief she knows more about this dead woman than she chooses to tell. But what could she have told Fitzgerald to make him act in this silly manner? A stranger who comes from England and dies in a Melbourne slum can't possibly know anything about Miss Frettleby. Not unless Miss Frettleby was secretly married to White, suggested Kilsip, and the Queen knew it. Nonsense, retorted Carlton, sharply. Why, she hated him and loves Fitzgerald. Besides, why on earth should she marry secretly and make a confidant of a woman in one of the lowest parts of Melbourne? At one time her father wanted her to marry White, but she made such strong opposition that he eventually gave his consent to her engagement with Fitzgerald. And White, oh, he had a row with Mr. Frettleby and left the house in a rage. He was murdered the same night, for the sake of some papers he carried. Oh, that's Gorby's idea, said Kilsip scornfully, with a vicious snarl. And it's mine too, answered Carlton firmly. White had some valuable papers, which he always carried about with him. The woman who died evidently told Fitzgerald that he did so. I gathered as much from an accidental admission he made. Kilsip looked puzzled. I must confess that it is a riddle, he said at length. But if Mr. Fitzgerald would only speak, it would clear everything up. Speak about what? The man who murdered White? Well, if he did not go quite so far as that he might at least supply the motive for the crime. Perhaps so, answered Carlton, as the detective rose to go, but it's no use. Fitzgerald, for some reason or another, has evidently made up his mind not to speak, so our only hope in saving him lies in finding this girl. If she's anywhere in Australia, you may be sure she'll be found, answered Kilsip, confidently, as he took his departure. Australia isn't so overcrowded as all that. But if Sal Rawlins was in Australia at all, she certainly must have been in some very remote part. All efforts to find her proved futile. It was an open question if she was alive or dead. She seemed to have vanished completely. She was last seen in a Sydney den with a Chinaman whom afterwards she appears to have left. Since then, nothing whatever was known of her. Notices offering large rewards for her discovery were inserted in all the newspapers, Australian and New Zealand, but nothing came of them. As she herself was unable to read, there seemed little chance of her knowing of them. And if, as Carlton surmised, she had changed her name, no one would be likely to tell her of them. There was only the bare chance that she might hear of them casually, or that she might turn up of her own accord. If she returned to Melbourne, she would certainly go to her grandmother's. She had no motive for not doing so. So Kilsip kept a sharp watch on the house, much to Mrs. Rawlins' disgust, for with true English pride, she objected to this system of espionage. "Cuss him," she croaked over her evening drink to an old crone as withered and evil-looking as herself. "Why can't he stop in his own bloomin' ooze and leave mine alone? A comin' round here a pokin' and pryin' and aper-winning people from earning their livin' when they gettin' drunk when they ain't well." "What do we want?" asked her friend, rubbing her weak old knees. He wants his throat cut," said Mother Guttersnipe viciously. "And this help me I'll do for him some night, double. He's a watchin' round air as if it were Pentridge. He can get what he can out of that whelp as ran away. But I knows suthin. He don't know, cuss him." She ended with a senile laugh, and her companion, having taken advantage of the long speech to drink some gin out of the broken cup, Mother Guttersnipe seized the unfortunate old creature by the hair, and in spite of her feeble cries, banged her head against the wall. "I'll have the perlicin at yer," whimpered the assaulted one, as she tottered as quickly away as her rheumatics would allow her. "See if I don't." "Get out," retorted Mother Guttersnipe indifferently, as she filled herself a fresh cup. "You come a-fallion round, eggin' priggin' my drinks, cuss you, and I'll cut your throat and wring your wicked old idiorf." The other gave a howl of dismay at hearing this pleasant proposal, and tottered out as quickly as possible, leaving Mother Guttersnipe in undisputed possession of the field. Meanwhile, Carlton had seen Brian several times and used every argument in his power to get him to tell everything, but he either maintained an obstinate silence or merely answered. It would only break her heart. He admitted to Carlton, after a good deal of questioning, that he had been at Mother Guttersnipe's on the night of the murder. After he had left White by the corner of the Scotch Church, as the cabman, Royston, had stated, he had gone along Russell Street and met Sal Rawlins near the Unicorn Hotel. She had taken him to Mother Guttersnipe's, where he had seen the dying woman, who had told him something he could not reveal. "Well," said Mr. Carlton, after hearing the admission, "you might have saved us all this trouble by admitting this before, and yet kept your secret, whatever it may be. Had you done so, we might have got hold of Sal Rawlins before she left Melbourne. But now it's a mere chance whether she turns up or not." Brian did not answer to this. In fact, he seemed hardly to be thinking of what the lawyer was saying. But just as Carlton was leaving, he asked, "How is Madge?" "How can you expect her to be?" said Carlton, turning angrily on him. "She is very ill, owing to the worry she has had over this affair." My darling," cried Brian, in agony, clasping his hands above his head. "I did it only to save you." Carlton approached him and laid his hand lightly on his shoulder. "My dear fellow," he said gravely, "the confidences between lawyer and client are as sacred as those between priest and penitent. You must tell me this secret which concerns Miss Frettleby so deeply." "No," said Brian, firmly, "I will never repeat what that wretched woman told me. When I would not tell you before in order to save my life, it is not likely I am going to do so now when I have nothing to gain and everything to lose by telling it." "I will never ask you again," said Carlton, rather annoyed, as he walked to the door. "And as to this accusation of murder, if I can find this girl, you are safe." When the lawyer left the jail, he went to the detective office to see Kilsip and ascertain if there was any news of Sal Rawlins. But, as usual, there was none. "It is fighting against fate," he said sadly as he went away. "His life hangs on a mere chance." The trial was fixed to come off in September, and of course, there was great excitement in Melbourne as the time drew near. Great, therefore, was the disappointment when it was discovered that the prisoner's counsel had applied for an adjournment of the trial till October, on the ground that an important witness for the defense could not be found. Chapter 17. The Trial. In spite of the utmost vigilance on the part of the police, and the offer of a large reward, both by Carlton, on behalf of the accused, and by Mr. Frettleby, the much-desired Sal Rawlins still remained hidden. The millionaire had maintained a most friendly attitude towards Brian throughout the whole affair. He refused to believe him guilty, and when Carlton told him of the defense of proving an alibi by means of Sal Rawlins, He immediately offered a large reward, which was in itself enough to set every person with any time on their hands hunting for the missing witness. All Australia and New Zealand rang with the extremely plebeian name of Sal Rawlins, the papers being full of notices offering rewards, and handbills of staring red letters were posted up in all railway stations, in conjunction with liquid sunshine, rum, and DWD whiskey. She had become famous without knowing it, unless, indeed, she had kept herself concealed purposely, but this was hardly probable, as there was no apparent motive for her doing so. If she was above ground, she must certainly have seen the handbills, if not the papers, and though not able to read, she could hardly help hearing something about the one topic of conversation throughout Australia. Notwithstanding all this, Sal Rawlins was still undiscovered, and Carlton, in despair, began to think that she must be dead. But Madge, though at times her courage gave way, was still hopeful. God will not permit such a judicial crime as the murder of an innocent man to be committed, she declared. Mr. Carlton, to whom she said this, shook his head doubtfully. God has permitted it to take place before, he answered softly, and we can only judge the future by the past. At last, the day of the long-expected trial came, and as Carlton sat in his office looking over his brief, a clerk entered and told him Mr. Frettleby and his daughter wished to see him. When they came in, the barrister saw that the millionaire looked haggard and ill, and there was a worried expression on his face. "There is my daughter, Carlton," he said, after hurried greetings had been exchanged. "She wants to be present in court during Fitzgerald's trial, and nothing I can say will dissuade her." Carlton turned and looked at the girl in some surprise. "Yes," she answered, meeting his look steadily, though her face was very pale. "I must be there. I shall go mad with anxiety unless I know how the trial goes on. But think of the disagreeable amount of attention you will attract," urged the lawyer. "No one will recognize me," she said calmly. "I am very plainly dressed, and I will wear this veil." And, drawing one from her pocket, she went to a small looking-glass which was hanging on the wall, and tied it over her face. Carlton looked in perplexity at Mr. Frettleby. "I'm afraid you must consent," he said. "Very well," replied the other, almost sternly, while a look of annoyance passed over his face. "I shall leave her in your charge." "And you?" "I'm not coming," answered Frettleby, quickly, putting on his hat. "I don't care about seeing a man whom I have had at my dinner table in the prisoner's dock, much as I sympathize with him. Good day." And with a curt nod he took his leave. When the door closed on her father, Madge placed her hand on Carlton's arm. "Any hope?" she whispered, looking at him through the black veil. "The merest chance," answered Carlton, putting his brief into his bag. "We have done everything in our power to discover this girl, but without result. If she does not come at the 11th hour, I'm afraid Brian Fitzgerald is a doomed man." Madge fell on her knees with a stifled cry. "Oh, God of mercy," she cried, raising her hands as if in prayer. "Save him. Save my darling, and let him not die for the crime of another. God!" She dropped her face in her hands and wept convulsively, as the lawyer touched her lightly on the shoulder. "Come," he said kindly. "Be the brave girl you were, and we may save him yet. The hour is darkest before the dawn, you know." Madge dried her tears and followed the lawyer to the cab, which was waiting for them at the door. They drove quickly up to the court, and Carlton put her in a quiet place, where she could see the dock, and yet be unobserved by the people in the body of the court. Just as he was leaving her, she touched his arm. "Tell him," she whispered in a trembling voice. "Tell him I am here." Carlton nodded, and hurried away to put on his wig and gown, while Madge looked hurriedly round the court from her point of vantage. It was crowded with fashionable Melbourne of both sexes, and they were all talking together in subdued whispers. The popular character of the prisoner, his good looks and engagement to Madge Frettleby, together with the extraordinary circumstances of the case, had raised public curiosity to the highest pitch, and consequently, everybody who could possibly manage to gain admission was there. Felix Ralston had secured an excellent seat beside the pretty Miss Featherweight, whom he admired so much, and he was chattering to her with the utmost volubility. "Puts me in mind of the Colosseum and all that sort of thing, you know," he said, putting up his eyeglass and staring round. "Butchered to make a Roman holiday, by Jove. Don't say such horrid things, you frivolous creature, simpered Miss Featherweight, using her smelling bottle. We are all here out of sympathy for that poor dear Mr. Fitzgerald. The mercurial Felix, who had more cleverness in him than people gave him credit for, smiled outright at this eminently feminine way of covering an overpowering curiosity. Ah, yes, he said lightly, exactly. I dare say Eve only ate the apple because she didn't like to see such a lot of good fruit go to waste. Miss Featherweight eyed him doubtfully. She was not quite certain whether he was in jest or earnest. Just as she was about to reply to the effect that she thought it wicked to make the Bible a subject for joking, the judge entered and the court rose. When the prisoner was brought in, there was a great flutter among the ladies, and some of them even had the bad taste to produce opera glasses. Brian noticed this, and he flushed up to the roots of his fair hair, for he felt his degradation acutely. He was an intensely proud man, and to be placed in the criminal dock with a lot of frivolous people who had called themselves his friends, looking at him as though he were a new actor or a wild animal, was galling in the extreme. He was dressed in black and looked pale and worn, but all the ladies declared that he was as good-looking as ever, and they were sure he was innocent. The jury were sworn in, and the Crown prosecutor rose to deliver his opening address. Most of those present knew the facts only through the medium of the newspapers, and such floating rumors as they had been able to gather. They were therefore unaware of the true history of events which had led to Fitzgerald's arrest, and they prepared to listen to the speech with profound attention. The ladies ceased to talk, the men to stare round, and nothing could be seen but row after row of eager and attentive faces, hanging on the words that issued from the lips of the Crown prosecutor. He was not a great orator, but he spoke clearly and distinctly, and every word could be heard in the dead silence. He gave a rapid sketch of the crime, merely a repetition of what had been published in the newspapers, and then proceeded to enumerate the witnesses for the prosecution. He would call the landlady of the deceased to show that ill feeling existed between the prisoner and the murdered man, and that the accused had called on the deceased a week prior to the committal of the crime and threatened his life. There was great excitement at this, and several ladies decided on the spur of the moment that the horrid man was guilty, but the majority of them still refused to believe in the guilt of such a good-looking young fellow. He would call a witness who could prove that White was drunk on the night of the murder and went along Russell Street in the direction of Collins Street. The cabman Royston could swear to the fact that the prisoner had hailed the cab, and after going away for a short time, returned and entered the cab with the deceased. He would also prove that the prisoner left the cab at the grammar school in the street Kilda Road, and on the arrival of the cab at the junction, he discovered the deceased had been murdered. The cabman Rankin would prove that he drove the prisoner from the street Kilda Road to Powlett Street in East Melbourne, where he got out, and he would call the prisoner's landlady to prove that the prisoner resided in Powlett Street, and that on the night of the murder he had not reached home till shortly after 2 o'clock. He would also call the detective who had charge of the case to prove the finding of a glove belonging to the deceased in the pocket of the coat which the prisoner wore on the night of the murder. And the doctor who had examined the body of the deceased would give evidence that the death was caused by inhalation of chloroform. As he had now fully shown the chain of evidence which he proposed to prove, he would call the first witness, Malcolm Royston. Royston, on being sworn, gave the same evidence as he had given at the inquest, from the time that the cab was hailed up to his arrival at the St. Kilda police station with the dead body of White. In the cross-examination, Carlton asked him if he was prepared to swear that the man who hailed the cab and the man who got in with the deceased were one and the same person. Witness: I am. Carlton: you are quite certain? Witness: yes, quite certain. Carlton: do you then recognize the prisoner as the man who hailed the cab? Witness: hesitatingly, I cannot swear to that. The gentleman who hailed the cab had his hat pulled down over his eyes, so that I could not see his face, but the height and general appearance of the prisoner are the same. Carlton: then it is only because the man who got into the cab was dressed like the prisoner on that night that you thought they were both the same? Witness: it never struck me for a minute that they were not the same. Besides, he spoke as if he had been there before. I said, "Oh, you've come back," and he said, "Yes, I'm going to take him home," and got into my cab. Carlton: did you notice any difference in his voice? Witness: no, except that the first time I saw him he spoke in a loud voice, and the second time he came back very low. Carlton, you were sober, I suppose? Witness, indignantly, yes, quite sober. Carlton, you did not have a drink, say at the Oriental Hotel, which I believe is near the rank where your cab stands? Witness, hesitating, well, I might have had a glass. Carlton, so you might have had several. Witness, sulkily, well, there's no law against a cove feeling thirsty. Carlton, certainly not. And I suppose you took advantage of the absence of such a law. Witness, defiantly, yes, I did. Carlton, and you were elevated? Witness, yes, on my cab to laughter. Carlton, severely, you are here to give evidence, sir, not to make jokes, however clever they may be. Were you, or were you not, slightly the worse for drink? Witness, I might have been. Carlton, so you were in such a condition that you did not observe very closely the man who hailed you? Witness, no, I didn't. There was no reason why I should. I didn't know a murder was going to be committed. Carlton, and it never struck you it might be a different man? Witness, no, I thought it was the same man the whole time. This closed Royston's evidence, and Carlton sat down very dissatisfied at not being able to elicit anything more definite from him. One thing appeared clear, that someone must have dressed himself to resemble Brian, and have spoken in a low voice for fear of betraying himself. Clement Rankin, the next witness, deposed to having picked up the prisoner on the St. Kilda Road between 1 and 2 on Friday morning, and driven him to Pallet Street, East Melbourne. In the cross-examination, Carlton elicited one point in the prisoner's favor. Carlton, is the prisoner the same gentleman you drove to Pallet Street? Witness, confidently, low, yes. Carlton, how do you know? Did you see his face? Witness, no, his hat was pulled down over his eyes, and I could only see the ends of his mustache and his chin, but he carried himself the same as the prisoner, and his mustache is the same light color. Carlton, when you drove up to him on the St. Kilda Road, where was he, and what was he doing? Witness, he was near the grammar school, walking quickly in the direction of Melbourne, and was smoking a cigarette. Carlton, did he wear gloves? Witness, yes, one on the left hand, the other was bare. Carlton, did he wear any rings on the right hand? Witness, yes, a large diamond one on the forefinger. Carlton, are you sure? Witness, yes, because I thought it a curious place for a gentleman to wear a ring, and when he was paying me my fare, I saw the diamond glitter on his finger in the moonlight. Carlton, that will do. The counsel for the defense was pleased with this bit of evidence, as Fitzgerald detested rings and never wore any, so he made a note of the matter on his brief. Mrs. Hableton, the landlady of the deceased, was then called and deposed that Oliver White had lodged with her for nearly 2 months. He seemed a quiet enough young man, but often came home drunk. The only friend she knew he had was a Mr. Moreland, who was often with him. On the July 14th, the prisoner called to see Mr. White, and they had a quarrel. She heard White say, "She is mine, you can't do anything with her," and the prisoner answered, "I can kill you, and if you marry her I shall do so in the open street." She had no idea at the time of the name of the lady they were talking about. There was a great sensation in the court at these words, and half the people present looked upon such evidence as being sufficient in itself to prove the guilt of the prisoner. In cross-examination, Carlton was unable to shake the evidence of the witness, as she merely reiterated the same statements over and over again. The next witness was Mrs. Sampson, who crackled into the witness box dissolved in tears, and gave her answers in a piercingly shrill tone of anguish. She stated that the prisoner was in the habit of coming home early, but on the night of the murder, had come in shortly before 2 o'clock. Crown Prosecutor, referring to his brief, "You mean after 2. Witness, Avon made a mistake once, by saying 5 minutes after 2 to the policeman as called hisself or insurance agent, which he put the words into my mouth. I ain't a-going to do so again, it being 5 minutes afore 2, as I can swear to." Crown Prosecutor, you are sure your clock was right? Witness, it ain't been, but my nevy being a watchmaker, called unbeknown to me, and made it right on Thursday night, which it was Friday morning when Mr. Fitzgerald came home. Mrs. Sampson bravely stuck to this statement, and ultimately left the witness box in triumph, the rest of her evidence being comparatively unimportant as compared with this point of time. The witness Rankin, who drove the prisoner to Powlett Street, as sworn to by him, was recalled and gave evidence that it was 2 o'clock when the prisoner got down from his cab in Powlett Street. Crown Prosecutor: How do you know that? Witness: Because I heard the post office clock strike. Crown Prosecutor: Could you hear it at East Melbourne? Witness: It was a very still night, and I heard the chimes and then the hours strike quite plainly. This conflicting evidence as to time was a strong point in Brian's favor. If, as the landlady stated, on the authority of the kitchen clock, which had been put right on the day previous to the murder, Fitzgerald had come into the house at 5 minutes to 2, he could not possibly be the man who had alighted from Rankin's cab at 2 o'clock at Powlett Street. The next witness was Dr. Chinston, who swore to the death of the deceased by means of chloroform administered in a large quantity, and he was followed by Mr. Gorby, who deposed as to the finding of the glove belonging to the deceased in the pocket of the prisoner's coat. Roger Moreland, an intimate friend of the deceased, was next called. He stated that he had known the deceased in London and had met him in Melbourne. He was with him a great deal. On the night of the murder, he was in the Orient Hotel in Burke Street. White came in and was greatly excited. He was in evening dress and wore a light coat. They had several drinks together and then went up to an hotel in Russell Street and had some more drinks there. Both witness and deceased were intoxicated. White took off his light coat, saying he felt warm, and went out shortly afterwards, leaving witness asleep in the bar. He was awakened by the barman, who wanted him to leave the hotel. He saw that White had left his coat behind him and took it up with the intention of giving it to him. As he stood in the street, someone snatched the coat from him and made off with it. He tried to follow the thief, but he could not do so, being too intoxicated. He then went home and to bed, as he had to leave early for the country in the morning. In cross-examination: Carlton: When you went into the street, after leaving the hotel, did you see the deceased? Witness: No, I did not, but I was very drunk, and unless deceased had spoken to me, I would not have noticed him. Carlton: What was deceased excited about when you met him? Witness: I don't know. He did not say. Carlton: What were you talking about? Witness: All sorts of things. London principally. Carlton: Did the deceased mention anything about papers? Witness, surprised: No, he did not. Carlton: Are you sure? Witness: Quite sure. Carlton: What time did you get home? Witness: I don't know. I was too drunk to remember. This closed the case for the Crown, and as it was now late, the case was adjourned till the next day. The court was soon emptied of the busy, chattering crowd, and Carlton, on looking over his notes, found that the result of the first day's trial was 2 points in favor of Fitzgerald. First, the discrepancy of time in the evidence of Rankin and the landlady, Mrs. Sampson. Second, the evidence of the cabman Royston as to the wearing of a ring on the forefinger of the right hand by the man who murdered White, whereas the prisoner never wore rings. These were slender proofs of innocence to put against the overwhelming mass of evidence in favor of the prisoner's guilt. The opinions of all were pretty well divided, some being in favor and others against, when suddenly an event happened which surprised everyone. All over Melbourne extras were posted, and the news passed from lip to lip like wildfire. Return of the missing witness, Sal Rawlins. Chapter 18. Sal Rawlins tells all she knows. And, indeed, such was the case. Sal Rawlins had made her appearance at the 11th hour, to the heartfelt thankfulness of Carlton, who saw in her an angel from heaven, sent to save the life of an innocent man. It was at the conclusion of the trial, and, together with Madge, he had gone down to his office, when his clerk entered with a telegram. The lawyer opened it hastily, and, with a silent look of pleasure on his face, handed the telegram to Madge. She, womanlike, being more impulsive, gave a cry when she read it, and, falling on her knees, thanked God for having heard her prayers and saved her lover's life. "Take me to her at once," she implored the lawyer. She was anxious to hear from Sal Rawlins' own lips the joyful words which would save Brian from a felon's death. "No, my dear," answered Carlton, firmly but kindly. "I can hardly take a lady to the place where Sal Rawlins lives. You will know all tomorrow. But, meanwhile, you must go home and get some sleep. And you will tell him," she whispered, clasping her hands on Carlton's arm. "At once," he answered promptly. "And I will see Sal Rawlins tonight and hear what she has to say. Rest content, my dear," he added, as he placed her in the carriage. "He is perfectly safe now." Brian heard the good news with a deep feeling of gratitude, knowing that his life was safe and that he could still keep his secret. It was the natural revulsion of feeling after the unnatural life he had been leading since his arrest. When one is young and healthy, and has all the world before one, it is a terrible thing to contemplate a sudden death. And yet, in spite of his joy at being delivered from the hangman's rope, there mingled with his delight the horror of that secret which the dying woman had told him with such malignant joy. "I had rather she had died in silence than she should have bequeathed me this legacy of sorrow." And the jailer, seeing his haggard face the next morning, muttered to himself, "He wore blessed if the swell warn't sorry he wore safe." So while Brian was pacing up and down his cell during the weary watches of the night, Madge, in her own room, was kneeling beside her bed and thanking God for his great mercy. And Carlton, the good fairy of the two lovers, was hurrying towards the humble abode of Mrs. Rawlins, familiarly known as Mother Guttersnipe. Kilsip was beside him, and they were talking eagerly about the providential appearance of the invaluable witness. "What I like," observed Kilsip in his soft, purring tone, "is the cell it will be for that Gorby. He was so certain that Mr. Fitzgerald was the man, and when he gets off tomorrow Gorby will be in a rage." "Where was Sal the whole time?" asked Carlton, absently, not thinking of what the detective was saying. "Ill," answered Kilsip. "After she left the Chinaman, she went into the country, caught cold by falling into some river, and ended up by getting brain fever. Some people found her, took her in, and nursed her. When she got well, she came back to her grandmother's." "But why didn't the people who nursed her tell her she was wanted? They must have seen the papers." "Not they," retorted the detective. "They knew nothing." "Vegetables," muttered Carlton contemptuously. "How can people be so ignorant? Why, all Australia has been ringing with the case. At any rate, it's money out of their pocket." "Well, there's nothing more to tell," said Kilsip, "except that she turned up tonight at 5 o'clock, looking more like a corpse than anything else." When they entered the squalid, dingy passage that led to Mother Guttersnipe's abode, they saw a faint light streaming down the stair. As they climbed up, they could hear the rancorous voice of the old hag pouring forth alternate blessings and curses on her prodigal offspring, and the low tones of a girl's voice in reply. On entering the room, Carlton saw that the sick woman, who had been lying in the corner on the occasion of his last visit, was gone. Mother Guttersnipe was seated in front of the deal table, with a broken cup and her favorite bottle of spirits before her. She evidently intended to have a night of it in order to celebrate Sal's return, and had commenced early, so as to lose no time. Sal herself was seated on a broken chair and leaned wearily against the wall. She stood up as Carlton and the detective entered, and they saw that she was a tall, slender woman of about 25, not bad-looking, but with a pallid and haggard appearance from recent illness. She was clothed in a kind of tawdry blue dress, much soiled and torn, and had over her shoulders an old tartan shawl, which she drew tightly across her breast as the strangers entered. Her grandmother, who looked more weird and grotesquely horrible than ever, saluted Carlton and the detective on their entrance with a shrill yell and a volley of choice language. "Oh, ye come again. Ave ye," she screeched, raising her skinny arms. "To take my gal away from poor old grandmother, as nust cuss her, when her own mother had gone gallivanting with swells. I'll ave the lore of ye both. S help me, I will." Kilsip paid no attention to this outbreak of the old fury, but turned to the girl. "This is the gentleman who wants to speak to you," he said, gently, making the girl sit on the chair again, for indeed she looked too ill to stand. "Just tell him what you told me." "'Bout the Queen, sir," said Sal, in a low, hoarse voice, fixing her wild eyes on Carlton. "If I'd only known as you was wanting me, I'd ave come afore." "Where were you?" asked Carlton, in a pitying tone. "No, South Wales," answered the girl with a shiver. "The cove as I went with tea, Sydney left me. Yes, left me to die like a dog in the gutter." "Cuss him!" croaked the old woman in a sympathetic manner, as she took a drink from the broken cup. "I tooked up with a Chinaman, went on her granddaughter, wearily, and lived with him for a bit. It's orful, ain't it?" she said with a dreary laugh, as she saw the disgust on the lawyer's face. "But Chinamen ain't bad. They treat a poor girl a dash sight better nor a white cove does." They don't beat the life out of em with their fists, nor drag em about the floor by the hair. Cuss em, croaked Mother Guttersnipe drowsily. I'll tear their earts out. I think I must have gone mad, I must, said Sal, pushing her tangled hair off her forehead. For arter I left the Chiner Cove, I went on walkin' and walkin', right into the bush, trying to cool me for it felt on fire like. I went into a river and got wet, and then I took my Eden boots orf and lay down on the grass. And then the rain come on, and I walked to a ooze as was near where they took me in. Oh, sich kind people, she sobbed, stretching out her hands, that didn't badger me 'bout my soul but gave me good food to eat. I gave em a wrong name. I was so 'fraid of that army findin' me. Then I got ill, and knowed nothin' for weeks. They said I was orf my chump, and then I came back to see Grand. Cuss ye, said the old woman, but in such a tender tone that it sounded like a blessing. And did the people who took you and never tell you anything about the murder? Asked Calton. Sal shook her head. No, we're a long way in the country, and they never knowed anything. They didn't. Ah, that explains it, muttered Calton to himself. Come now, he said cheerfully. Tell me all that happened on the night you brought Mr. Fitzgerald to see the Queen. Who's he? Asked Sal, puzzled. Mr. Fitzgerald, the gentleman you brought the letter for to the Melbourne Club. Oh, said Sal, a sudden light breaking over her wan face. I never knowed his name afore. Calton nodded complacently. I knew you didn't, he said. That's why you didn't ask for him at the club. She never told me his name, said Sal, jerking her head in the direction of the bed. Then whom did she ask you to bring to her? Asked Calton, eagerly. No one, replied the girl. This was the way of it. On that night, she was orful ill, and I sat beside her while Gran was asleep. I was drunk, broken Gran, fiercely. None of your lies. I was blazing drunk, and she to me, she ses, went on the girl, indifferent to her grandmother's interruption. Give me some paper and a pencil, and I'll write a note to him. I will. So I goes and gets what she asks for out of Gran's box. Stole it, cuss ye, shrieked the old hag, shaking her fist. Hold your tongue, said Kilsip, in a peremptory tone. Mother Guttersnipe burst into a volley of oaths, and having run rapidly through all she knew, subsided into a sulky silence. She wrote on it, went on Sal, and then asked me to take it to the Melbourne Club and give it to him. SESI. Who's him? SES she. It's on the letter. Don't you ask no questions and you won't hear no lies, but give it to him at the club, and wait for him at the corner of Burke Street and Russell Street. So out I goes, and gives it to a cove at the club, and then he comes along and SS take me to her, and I took time. And what like was the gentleman? Oh, very good looking, said Sal. Very tall, with yeller hair and mustache. He had party clothes on, and a masher coat and a soft hat. That's Fitzgerald right enough, muttered Calton. And what did he do when he came? He goes right up to her, and she ses. Are you he? And he ses. I am. Then ses she. Do you know what I may go in to tell you? And he says no. Then she ses. It's about her. And ses looking very white. How dare you ave her name on your vile lips? And she gets up and screeches. Turn that gal out and I'll tell you. And he takes me by the arm. And ses get out. And I gets out and that's all I knows. And how long was he with her? Asked Calton, who had been listening attentively. About 'arf a hour, answered Sal. I takes him back to Russell Street 'bout 25 minutes to 2, 'cause I looked at the clock on the post office, and he gives me a SOV. And then he goes a-tearing up the street like anything. Take him about 20 minutes to walk to East Melbourne, said Calton to himself. So he must just have got in at the time, Mrs. Sampson said. He was in with the Queen the whole time, I suppose, he asked, looking keenly at Sal. I was at that door, said Sal, pointing to it, and he couldn't ave got out unless I'd seen I'm. Oh, it's all right, said Calton, nodding to Kilsip. There won't be any difficulty in proving an alibi. But I say, he added, turning to Sal, what were they talking about? I dunno, answered Sal. I was at the door, and they talks that quiet I couldn't hear him. Then he sings out, my gee, it's too horrible. And I hear Earl larf in like to bust, and then he comes to me and ses quite wild-like, take me out of this L, and I took time. And when you came back, she was dead, dead. "As a blessed doornail," said Sal, cheerfully. "And I never knowed I was in the room with a corpse," wailed Mother Guttersnipe, waking up. "Cuss, sir. She was allays doing contrary things." "How do you know?" said Calton, sharply, as he rose to go. "I knowed her longer nor you," croaked the old woman, fixing one evil eye on the lawyer. "And I know what you'd like to know, but you shan't. Calton turned from her, with a shrug of his shoulders. "You will come to the court tomorrow with Mr. Kilsip," he said to Sal, "and tell what you have just now told me." "It's all true, as help me," said Sal, eagerly. "You was air all the time." Calton stepped towards the door, followed by the detective, when Mother Guttersnipe rose. "Where's the money for Finn and her?" she screeched, pointing one skinny finger at Sal. "Well, considering the girl found herself," said Calton dryly, "the money is in the bank, and will remain there. And I'm to be done out of my hard-earned tin. S help me," howled the old fury. "Cuss ye, I'll ave the lore of ye, and get you put in quat." "You'll go there yourself if you don't take care," said Kilsip, in his soft, purring tones. "Yah!" shrieked Mother Guttersnipe, snapping her fingers at him. "What do I care about your quat? Ain't I been in Pintrick, and it ain't 'urt me, it ain't? I'm as lively as a gal. I am." And the old fury, to prove the truth of her words, danced a kind of war dance in front of Mr. Calton, snapping her fingers and yelling out curses, as an accompaniment to her ballet. Her luxurious white hair streamed out during her gyrations, and with her grotesque appearance and the faint light of the candle, she presented a gruesome spectacle. Calton remembered the tales he had heard of the women of Paris at the Revolution, and the way they danced La Carmagnole. Mother Guttersnipe would have been in her element in that sea of blood and turbulence, he thought. But he merely shrugged his shoulders and walked out of the room, as with a final curse, delivered in a hoarse voice, Mother Guttersnipe sank exhausted on the floor and yelled for gin. Chapter 19. The verdict of the jury. Next morning the court was crowded, and numbers were unable to gain admission. The news that Sal Rawlins, who alone could prove the innocence of the prisoner, had been found and would appear in court that morning, had spread like wildfire, and the acquittal of the prisoner was confidently expected by a large number of sympathizing friends, who seemed to have sprung up on all sides, like mushrooms, in a single night. There were, of course, plenty of cautious people left who waited to hear the verdict of the jury before committing themselves, and who still believed him to be guilty. But the unexpected appearance of Sal Rawlins had turned the great tide of public feeling in favor of the prisoner, and many who had been loudest in their denunciations of Fitzgerald were now more than half convinced of his innocence. Pious clergymen talked in an incoherent way about the finger of God and the innocent not suffering unjustly, which was a case of counting unhatched chickens, as the verdict had yet to be given. Felix Ralston awoke and found himself famous in a small way. Out of good-natured sympathy and a spice of contrariness, he had declared his belief in Brian's innocence, and now, to his astonishment, he found that his view of the matter was likely to prove correct. He received so much praise on all sides for his presumed perspicuity that he soon began to think that he had believed in Fitzgerald's innocence by a calm course of reasoning, and not because of a desire to differ from everyone else in their opinion of the case. After all, Felix Ralston is not the only man who has been astonished to find greatness thrust upon him and come to believe himself worthy of it. He was a wise man, however, and while in the full tide of prosperity, he seized the flying moment and proposed to Miss Featherweight, who, after some hesitation, agreed to endow him with herself and her thousands. She decided that her future husband was a man of no common intellect, seeing that he had long ago arrived at a conclusion which the rest of Melbourne were only beginning to discover now. So she determined that, as soon as she assumed marital authority, Felix, like Strephon in Iolanthe, should go into Parliament, and with her money and his brain she might some day be the wife of a premier. Mr. Ralston had no idea of the political honors which his future spouse intended for him, and was seated in his old place in the court, talking about the case. "Knew he was innocent, don't you know?" he said, with a complacent smile. "Fitzgerald's too jolly good-looking a fellow, and all that sort of thing, to commit murder." Whereupon a clergyman, happening to overhear the lively Felix make this flippant remark, disagreed with it entirely, and preached a sermon to prove that good looks and crime were closely connected, and that both Judas Iscariot and Nero were beauty men. "Ah," said Carlton when he heard the sermon, "if this unique theory is a true one, what a truly pious man that clergyman must be." This allusion to the looks of the reverend gentleman was rather unkind, for he was by no means bad-looking. But then Carlton was one of those witty men who would rather lose a friend than suppress an epigram. When the prisoner was brought in, a murmur of sympathy ran through the crowded court, so ill and worn out he looked. But Carlton was puzzled to account for the expression of his face, so different from that of a man whose life had been saved, or rather, was about to be saved, for in truth it was a foregone conclusion. "You know who stole those papers," he thought, as he looked at Fitzgerald keenly, "and the man who did so is the murderer of White." The judge having entered, and the court being opened, Carlton rose to make his speech, and stated in a few words the line of defense he intended to take. He would first call Albert Dendy, a watchmaker, to prove that on Thursday night, at 8 o'clock in the evening, he had called at the prisoner's lodgings while the landlady was out, and while there had put the kitchen clock right, and had regulated the same. He would also call Felix Ralston, a friend of the prisoner's, to prove that the prisoner was not in the habit of wearing rings, and frequently expressed his detestation of such a custom. Sebastian Brown, a waiter at the Melbourne club, would be called to prove that on Thursday night a letter was delivered to the prisoner at the club by one Sarah Rollins, and that the prisoner left the club shortly before 1 o'clock on Friday morning. He would also call Sarah Rollins to prove that she had delivered a note to Sebastian Brown for the prisoner at the Melbourne club at 11:45 on Thursday night, and that at a few minutes past 1 o'clock on Friday morning, she had conducted the prisoner to a slum off Little Burke Street, and that he was there between 1 and 2 on Friday morning, the hour at which the murder was alleged to have taken place. This being his defense to the charge brought against the prisoner, he would call Albert Dendy. Albert Dendy, duly sworn, stated, "I am a watchmaker and carry on business in Fitzroy. I remember Thursday, the 26th of July last. On the evening of that day, I called at Powlett Street, East Melbourne, to see my aunt, who is the landlady of the prisoner. She was out at the time I called, and I waited in the kitchen till her return. I looked at the kitchen clock to see if it was too late to wait, and then at my watch. I found that the clock was 10 minutes fast, upon which I put it right and regulated it properly." Carlton: "At what time did you put it right?" Witness: "About 8 o'clock. Carlton: "Between that time and 2 in the morning, was it possible for the clock to gain 10 minutes? Witness: "No, it was not possible." Carlton: "Would it gain at all?" Witness: "Not between 8 and 2 o'clock. The time was not long enough." Carlton: "Did you see your aunt that night?" Witness: "Yes, I waited till she came in." Carlton: "And did you tell her you had put the clock right?" Witness: "No, I did not. I forgot all about it." Carlton: "Then she was still under the impression that it was 10 minutes fast?" Witness: "Yes, I suppose so." After Dendy had been cross-examined, Felix Ralston was called and deposed as follows. "I am an intimate friend of the prisoner. I have known him for 5 or 6 years, and I never saw him wearing a ring during that time. He has frequently told me he did not care for rings and would never wear them." In cross-examination, Crown Prosecutor: "You have never seen the prisoner wearing a diamond ring?" Witness: "No, never." Crown Prosecutor: "Have you ever seen any such ring in his possession?" Witness: "No. I have seen him buying rings for ladies, but I never saw him with any ring such as a gentleman would wear." Crown Prosecutor: "Not even a seal ring?" Witness: "No, not even a seal ring." Sarah Rollins was then placed in the witness box, and after having been sworn, deposed. "I know the prisoner. I delivered a letter addressed to him at the Melbourne Club at 11:45 o'clock on Thursday, July 26th. I did not know what his name was. He met me shortly after 1 at the corner of Russell and Burke Streets, where I had been told to wait for him. I took him to my grandmother's place in a lane off Little Burke Street. There was a dying woman there who had sent for him. He went in and saw her for about 20 minutes, and then I took him back to the corner of Burke and Russell Streets. I heard the 3/4 strike shortly after I left him." Crown Prosecutor: "You are quite certain that the prisoner was the man you met on that night?" Witness: "Quite certain. Help me G." Crown Prosecutor: "And he met you a few minutes past 1 o'clock?" Witness: "Yes, about 5 minutes. I heard the clock is striking 1 just afore he came down the street, and when I leaves him agin, it were about 25 to 2, 'cause it took me 10 minutes to get home, and I heard the clock go 3/4 just as I gets to the door. Crown Prosecutor: How do you know it was exactly 25 to 2 when you left him? Witness: 'Cause I saw the clocks. I left him at the corner of Russell Street and comes down Burke Street, so I could see the post orifice clock as plain as day, and when I gets into Swanson Street, I looks at the town all premiscus-like and sees the same time there. Crown Prosecutor: And you never lost sight of the prisoner the whole time? Witness: No, there was only one door by the room, and I was sitting outside it, and when he comes out he falls over me. Crown Prosecutor: Were you asleep? Witness: Not a blessed wink. Carlton then directed Sebastian Brown to be called. He deposed: I know the prisoner. He is a member of the Melbourne Club, at which I am a waiter. I remember Thursday, July 26th. On that night, the last witness came with a letter to the prisoner. It was about 11:45. She just gave it to me and went away. I delivered it to Mr. Fitzgerald. He left the club at about 10 minutes to 1. This closed the evidence for the defense. And after the Crown Prosecutor had made his speech, in which he pointed out the strong evidence against the prisoner, Carlton arose to address the jury. He was a fine speaker and made a splendid defense. Not a single point escaped him, and that brilliant piece of oratory is still remembered and spoken of admiringly in the purlieus of Temple Court and Chancery Lane. He began by giving a vivid description of the circumstances of the murder, of the meeting of the murderer and his victim in Collins Street East, the cab driving down to St. Kilda, the getting out of the cab of the murderer after committing the crime, and the way in which he had secured himself against pursuit. Having thus enchained the attention of the jury by the graphic manner in which he described the crime, he pointed out that the evidence brought forward by the prosecution was purely circumstantial, and that they had utterly failed to identify the prisoner in the dock with the man who entered the cab. The supposition that the prisoner and the man in the light coat were one and the same person rested solely upon the evidence of the cabman, Royston, who, although not intoxicated, was judging from his own statements, not in a fit state to distinguish between the man who hailed the cab and the man who got in. The crime was committed by means of chloroform. Therefore, if the prisoner was guilty, he must have purchased the chloroform in some shop or obtained it from some friends. At all events, the prosecution had not brought forward a single piece of evidence to show how and where the chloroform had been obtained. With regard to the glove belonging to the murdered man found in the prisoner's pocket, he picked it up off the ground at the time when he first met White, when the deceased was lying drunk near the Scotch church. Certainly, there was no evidence to show that the prisoner had picked it up before the deceased entered the cab. But, on the other hand, there was no evidence to show that it had been picked up in the cab. It was far more likely that the glove, and especially a white glove, would be picked up under the light of the lamp near the Scotch church, where it was easily noticeable, than in the darkness of a cab, where there was very little room, and where it would be quite dark, as the blinds were drawn down. The cabman, Royston, swore positively that the man who got out of his cab on the St. Kilda Road wore a diamond ring on the forefinger of his right hand, and the cabman, Rankin, swore to the same thing about the man who got out at Powlett Street. Against this could be placed the evidence of one of the prisoner's most intimate friends, one who had seen him almost daily for the last 5 years, and he had sworn positively that the prisoner was not in the habit of wearing rings. The cabman Rankin had also sworn that the man who entered his cab on the St. Kilda Road alighted at Powlett Street, East Melbourne, at 2 o'clock on Friday morning, as he heard that hour strike from the post office clock, whereas the evidence of the prisoner's landlady showed plainly that he entered the house 5 minutes previously, and her evidence was further supported by that of the watchmaker, Dendy. Mrs. Sampson saw the hand of her kitchen clock point to 5 minutes to 2, and, thinking it was 10 minutes slow, told the detective that the prisoner did not enter the house till 5 minutes past 2, which would just give the man who alighted from the cab, presuming him to have been the prisoner, sufficient time to walk up to his lodgings. The evidence of the watchmaker, Dendy, however, showed clearly that he had put the clock right at the hour of 8 on Thursday night, that it was impossible for it to gain 10 minutes before 2 on Friday morning, and therefore, the time, 5 minutes to 2, seen by the landlady was the correct one, and the prisoner was in the house 5 minutes before the other man alighted from the cab in Powlett Street. These points in themselves were sufficient to show that the prisoner was innocent. But the evidence of the woman Rawlins must prove conclusively to the jury that the prisoner was not the man who committed the crime. The witness Brown had proved that the woman Rollins had delivered a letter to him, which he gave to the prisoner, and that the prisoner left the club to keep the appointment spoken of in the letter, which letter, or rather, the remains of it had been put in evidence. The woman Rollins swore that the prisoner met her at the corner of Russell and Burke Streets, and had gone with her to one of the back slums, there to see the writer of the letter. She also proved that at the time of the committal of the crime, the prisoner was still in the back slum, by the bed of the dying woman, and, there being only one door to the room, he could not possibly have left without the witness seeing him. The woman Rollins further proved that she left the prisoner at the corner of Burke and Russell Streets at 25 minutes to 2 o'clock, which was 5 minutes before Royston drove his cab up to the Street Kilda police station, with the dead body inside. Finally, the woman Rollins proved her words by stating that she saw both the post office and town hall clocks. And supposing the prisoner started from the corner of Burke and Russell Streets, as she says he did, he would reach East Melbourne in 20 minutes, which made it 5 minutes to 2 on Friday morning, the time at which, according to the landlady's statement, he entered the house. All the evidence given by the different witnesses agreed completely, and formed a chain which showed the whole of the prisoner's movements at the time of the committal of the murder. Therefore, it was absolutely impossible that the murder could have been committed by the man in the dock. The strongest piece of evidence brought forward by the prosecution was that of the witness Hableton, who swore that the prisoner used threats against the life of the deceased. But the language used was merely the outcome of a passionate Irish nature, and was not sufficient to prove the crime to have been committed by the prisoner. The defense which the prisoner set up was that of an alibi, and the evidence of the witnesses for the defense proved conclusively that the prisoner could not, and did not, commit the murder. Finally, Carlton wound up his elaborate and exhaustive speech, which lasted for over 2 hours, by a brilliant peroration, calling upon the jury to base their verdict upon the plain facts of the case. And if they did so, they could hardly fail in bringing in a verdict of not guilty. When Carlton sat down, a subdued murmur of applause was heard, which was instantly suppressed, and the judge began to sum up, strongly in favor of Fitzgerald. The jury then retired, and immediately there was a dead silence in the crowded court, an unnatural silence, such as must have fallen on the blood-loving Roman populace when they saw the Christian martyrs kneeling on the hot yellow sands of the arena, and watched the long, lithe forms of lion and panther creeping steadily towards their prey. The hour being late, the gas had been lighted, and there was a sickly glare through the wide hall. Fitzgerald had been taken out of court on the retiring of the jury, but the spectators stared steadily at the empty dock, which seemed to enchain them by some indescribable fascination. They conversed among themselves only in whispers, until even the whispering ceased, and nothing could be heard but the steady ticking of the clock, and now and then the quick-drawn breath of some timid onlooker. Suddenly, a woman, whose nerves were overstrung, shrieked, and the cry rang weirdly through the crowded hall. She was taken out, and again there was silence, every eye being now fixed on the door through which the jury would reissue with their verdict of life or death. The hands of the clock moved slowly round, a quarter, a half, 3/4, and then the hour sounded with a silvery ring which startled everyone. Madge, sitting with her hands tightly clasped together, began to fear that her highly strung nerves would give way. My God, she muttered softly to herself, will this suspense never end? Just then the door opened, and the jury re-entered. The prisoner was again placed in the dock, and the judge resumed his seat, this time with a black cap in his pocket, as everyone guessed. The usual formalities were gone through, and when the foreman of the jury stood up, every neck was craned forward, and every ear was on the alert to catch the words that fell from his lips. The prisoner flushed a little, and then grew pale as death, giving a quick, nervous glance at the quiet figure in black, of which he could just catch a glimpse. Then came the verdict, sharp and decisive, not guilty. On hearing this, a cheer went up from everyone in the court, so strong was the sympathy with Brian. In vain the crier of the court yelled, "Order," until he was red in the face. In vain the judge threatened to commit all present for contempt of court, his voice being inaudible. It did not matter much. The enthusiasm could not be restrained, and it was 5 minutes before order was obtained. The judge, having recovered his composure, delivered his judgment and discharged the prisoner in accordance with the verdict. Carlton had won many cases, but it is questionable if he had ever heard a verdict which gave him so much satisfaction as that which proclaimed Fitzgerald innocent. And Brian, stepping down from the dock a free man, passed through a crowd of congratulating friends to a small room off the court, where a woman was waiting for him. A woman who clung round his neck and sobbed out, "My darling! My darling! I knew that God would save you." Chapter 20. The Argus gives its opinion. The morning after the trial was concluded, the following article in reference to the matter appeared in the Argus. During the past 3 months, we have frequently in our columns commented on the extraordinary case, which is now so widely known as the Hansom Cab tragedy. We can safely say that it is the most remarkable case which has ever come under the notice of our criminal court, and the verdict given by the jury yesterday has enveloped the matter in a still deeper mystery. By a train of strange coincidences, Mr. Brian Fitzgerald, a young squatter, was suspected of having murdered White, and had it not been for the timely appearance of the woman Rawlins, who turned up at the 11th hour, we feel sure that a verdict of guilty would have been given, and an innocent man would have suffered punishment for the crime of another. Fortunately for the prisoner, and for the interests of justice, his counsel, Mr. Carlton, by unwearied diligence, was able to discover the last witness and prove an alibi. Had it not been for this, in spite of the remarks made by the learned counsel in his brilliant speech yesterday, which resulted in the acquittal of the prisoner, we question very much if the rest of the evidence in favor of the accused would have been sufficient to persuade the jury that he was an innocent man. The only points in favor of Mr. Fitzgerald were the inability of the cabman Royston to swear to him as the man who had got into the cab with White, the wearing of a diamond ring on the forefinger of the right hand, whereas Mr. Fitzgerald wears no rings, and the difference in time sworn to by the cabman Rankin and the landlady. Against these points, however, the prosecution placed a mass of evidence, which seemed conclusively to prove the guilt of the prisoner. But the appearance of Sal Rawlins in the witness box put an end to all doubt. In language which could not be mistaken for anything else than the truth, she positively swore that Mr. Fitzgerald was in one of the slums off Burke Street, between the hours of 1 and 2 on Friday morning, at which time the murder was committed. Under these circumstances, the jury unanimously agreed and returned a verdict of not guilty, and the prisoner was forthwith acquitted. We have to congratulate his counsel, Mr. Carlton, for the able speech he made for the defense, and also Mr. Fitzgerald for his providential escape from a dishonorable and undeserved punishment. He leaves the court without a stain on his character, and with the respect and sympathy of all Australians, for the courage and dignity with which he comported himself throughout, while resting under the shadow of such a serious charge. But now that it has been conclusively proved that he is innocent, the question arises in everyone's mind: who is the murderer of Oliver White? The man who committed this dastardly crime is still at large, and for all we know, may be in our midst. Emboldened by the impunity with which he has escaped the hands of justice, he may be walking securely down our streets and talking of the very crime of which he is the perpetrator. Secure in the thought that all traces of him have been lost forever, from the time he alighted from Rankin's cab at Powlett Street, he has ventured probably to remain in Melbourne, and for all that anyone knows, he may have been in the court during the late trial. Nay, this very article may meet his eye, and he may rejoice at the futile efforts which have been made to find him. But let him beware. Justice is not blind, but blindfolded, and when he least expects it, she will tear the bandage from her keen eyes and drag him forth to the light of day to receive the reward of his deed. Owing to the strong evidence against Fitzgerald, that is the only direction in which the detectives have hitherto looked, but baffled on one side, they will look on the other, and this time may be successful. That such a man as the murderer of Oliver White should be at large is a matter of danger, not only to individual citizens, but to the community at large. For it is a well-known fact that a tiger who once tastes human blood never overcomes his craving for it. And without doubt the man who so daringly and coolly murdered a drunken and therefore defenseless man will not hesitate to commit a second crime. The present feeling of all classes in Melbourne must be one of terror, that such a man should be at large, and must, in a great measure, resemble the fear which filled everyone's heart in London when the Marr murders were committed, and it was known that the murderer had escaped. Anyone who has read De Quincey's graphic description of the crime perpetrated by Williams must tremble to think that such another devil incarnate is in our midst. It is an imperative necessity that such a feeling should be done away with. But how is this to be managed? It is one thing to speak and another to act. There seems to be no possible clue discoverable at present which can lead to the discovery of the real murderer. The man in the light coat who got out of Rankin's cab at Powlett Street, East Melbourne, designedly, as it now appears, in order to throw suspicion on Fitzgerald, has vanished as completely as the witches in Macbeth and left no trace behind. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when he left the cab, and in a quiet suburb like East Melbourne, no one would be about so that he could easily escape unseen. There seems to be only one chance of ever tracing him, and that is to be found in the papers which were stolen from the pocket of the dead man. What they were, only 2 persons knew, and one knows now. The first 2 were White and the woman who was called the Queen, and both of them are now dead. The other who knows now is the man who committed the crime. There can be no doubt that these papers were the motive for the crime, as no money was taken from the pockets of the deceased. The fact, also, that the papers were carried in a pocket made inside the waistcoat of the deceased shows that they were of value. Now, the reason we think that the dead woman knew of the existence of these papers is simply this. It appears that she came out from England with White as his mistress, and after staying some time in Sydney, came on to Melbourne. How she came into such a foul and squalid den as that she died in, we are unable to say, unless, seeing that she was given to drink, she was picked up drunk by some Samaritan of the slums and carried to Mrs. Rawlins' humble abode. White visited her there frequently, but appears to have made no attempt to remove her to a better place, alleging as his reason that the doctor said she would die if taken into the air. Our reporter learned from one of the detectives that the dead woman was in the habit of talking to White about certain papers, and on one occasion was overheard to say to him, "They'll make your fortune if you play your cards well." This was told to the detective by the woman Rawlins, to whose providential appearance Mr. Fitzgerald owes his escape. From this it can be gathered that the papers, whatever they might be, were of value and sufficient to tempt another to commit a murder in order to obtain them. White, therefore, being dead, and his murderer having escaped, the only way of discovering the secret which lies at the root of this tree of crime is to find out the history of the woman who died in the slum. Trace back for some years, circumstances may be discovered which will reveal what these papers contained, and once that is found, we can confidently say that the murderer will soon be discovered. This is the only chance of finding out the cause and the author of this mysterious murder. And if it fails, we fear the Hansom Cab tragedy will have to be relegated to the list of undiscovered crimes, and the assassin of White will have no other punishment than that of the remorse of his own conscience. Chapter 21. 3 months afterwards. A hot December day, with a cloudless blue sky, and a sun blazing down on the earth, clothed in all the beauty of summer garments. Such a description of snowy December sounds perchance a trifle strange to English ears. It may strike them as being somewhat fantastic, as was the play in A Midsummer Night's Dream, to Demetrius when he remarked, "This is hot ice and wondrous cold fire." But here in Australia, we are in the realm of contrariety, and many things other than dreams go by contrary. Here black swans are an established fact, and the proverb concerning them, made when they were considered as mythical a bird as the phoenix, has been rendered null and void by the discoveries of Captain Cook. Here ironwood sinks and pumice stone floats, which must strike the curious spectator as a queer freak on the part of Dame Nature. At home the Edinburgh mail bears the hardy traveler to a cold climate, with snowy mountains and wintry blasts. But here the further north one goes the hotter it gets, till one arrives in Queensland, where the heat is so great that a profane traveler of an epigrammatic turn of mind once fittingly called it an amateur hell. But however contrary, as Mrs. Gamp would say, nature may be in her dealings, the English race out in this great continent are much the same as in the old country. John Bull, Paddy, and Sandy, all being of a conservative turn of mind, and with strong opinions as to the keeping up of old customs. Therefore, on a hot Christmas day, with the sun 100-odd in the shade, Australian revelers sit down to the roast beef and plum pudding of Old England, which they eat contentedly as the orthodox thing, And on New Year's Eve, the festive Celt repairs to the doors of his friends with a bottle of whiskey and a cheering verse of Auld Lang Syne. Still, it is these peculiar customs that give an individuality to a nation, and John Bull abroad loses none of his insular obstinacy, but keeps his Christmas in the old fashion, and wears his clothes in the new fashion, without regard to heat or cold. A nation that never surrenders to the fire of an enemy cannot be expected to give in to the fire of the sun. But if some ingenious mortal would only invent some light and airy costume, after the fashion of the Greek dress, and Australians would consent to adopt the same, life in Melbourne and her sister cities would be much cooler than it is at present. Madge was thinking somewhat after this fashion as she sat on the wide veranda, in a state of exhaustion from the heat, and stared out at the wide plains lying parched and arid under the blazing sun. There was a dim kind of haze rising from the excessive heat, hanging midway between heaven and earth, and through its tremulous veil, the distant hills looked aerial and unreal. Stretched out before her was the garden with its intensely vivid flowers. To look at them merely was to increase one's caloric condition. Great bushes of oleanders, with their bright pink blossoms, luxurious rose trees, with their yellow, red, and white blooms, and all along the border a rainbow of many-colored flowers, with such brilliant tints that the eye ached to see them in the hot sunshine, and turned restfully to the cool green of the trees which encircled the lawn. In the center was a round pool, surrounded by a ring of white marble, and containing a still sheet of water, which flashed like a mirror in the blinding light. The homestead of Yabba Yaluk Station was a long, low house, with no upper story, and with a wide veranda running nearly round it. Cool green blinds were hung between the pillars to keep out the sun, and all along were scattered lounging chairs of basketwork with rugs, novels, empty soda-water bottles, and all the other evidences that Mr. Frettleby's guests had been wise and stayed inside during the noonday heat. Madge was seated in one of these comfortable chairs, and she divided her attention between the glowing beauty of the world outside, which she could see through a narrow slit in the blinds. But she did not seem greatly interested in her book, and it was not long before she let it fall unheeded to the ground and took refuge in her own thoughts. The trial through which she had so recently passed had been a great one, and it had not been without its outward result. It had left its impress on her beautiful face, and there was a troubled look in her eyes. After Brian's acquittal of the murder of Oliver White, she had been taken by her father up to the station, in the hope that it would restore her to health. The mental strain which had been on her during the trial had nearly brought on an attack of brain fever. But here, far from the excitement of town life, in the quiet seclusion of the country, she had recovered her health, but not her spirits. Women are more impressionable than men, and it is perhaps for this reason that they age quicker. A trouble which would pass lightly over a man leaves an indelible mark on a woman, both physically and mentally, and the terrible episode of White's murder had changed Madge from a bright and merry girl into a grave and beautiful woman. Sorrow is a potent enchantress. Once she touches the heart, life can never be quite the same again. We never more surrender ourselves entirely to pleasure, and often we find so many of the things we have longed for are, after all, but Dead Sea fruit. Sorrow is the veiled Isis of the world, and once we penetrate her mystery and see her deeply furrowed face and mournful eyes, the magic light of romance dies all away, and we realize the hard, bitter fact of life in all its nakedness. Madge felt something of all this. She saw the world now, not as the fantastic fairyland of her girlish dreams, but as the sorrowful vale of tears through which we must all walk till we reach the promised land. And Brian, he also had undergone a change, for there were a few white hairs now amid his curly, chestnut locks, and his character, from being gay and bright, had become moody and irritable. After the trial, he had left town immediately in order to avoid meeting with his friends, and had gone up to his station, which was next to that of the Frettlebys. There he worked hard all day, and smoked hard all night, thinking over the secret which the dead woman had told him, and which threatened to overshadow his life. Every now and then he rode over and saw Madge. But this was generally when he knew her father to be away from Melbourne, for of late he had disliked the millionaire. Madge could not but condemn his attitude, remembering how her father had stood beside him in his recent trouble. Yet there was another reason why Brian kept aloof from Yabba Yallook Station. He did not wish to meet any of the gay society which was there, knowing that since his trial, he was an object of curiosity and sympathy to everyone, a position galling enough to his proud nature. At Christmas time, Mr. Frettleby had asked several people up from Melbourne, and though Madge would rather have been left alone, yet she could not refuse her father, and had to play hostess with a smiling brow and aching heart. Felix Ralston, who a month since had joined the noble army of Benedicts, was there with Mrs. Ralston, any Miss Featherweight, who ruled him with a rod of iron. Having bought Felix with her money, she had determined to make good use of him, and, being ambitious to shine in Melbourne society, had insisted upon Felix studying politics, so that when the next general election came round he could enter Parliament. Felix had rebelled at first, but ultimately gave way, as he found that when he had a good novel concealed among his parliamentary papers, time passed quite pleasantly, and he got the reputation of a hard worker at little cost. They had brought up Julia with them, and this young person had made up her mind to become the second Mrs. Frettleby. She had not received much encouragement, but, like the English at Waterloo, did not know when she was beaten, and carried on the siege of Mr. Frettleby's heart in an undaunted manner. Dr. Chinston had come up for a little relaxation, and gave never a thought to his anxious patients or the many sick rooms he was in the habit of visiting. A young English fellow, called Peterson, who amused himself by traveling, an old colonist, full of reminiscences of the old days, when, by gad, sir, we hadn't a gas lamp in the whole of Melbourne, and several other people, completed the party. They had all gone off to the billiard room, and left Madge in her comfortable chair, half asleep. Suddenly she started, as she heard a step behind her, and turning, saw Sal Rawlins, in the neatest of black gowns, with a coquettish white cap and apron, and an open book. Madge had been so delighted with Sal for saving Brian's life that she had taken her into her service as maid. Mr. Frettleby had offered strong opposition at first that a fallen woman like Sal should be near his daughter, but Madge was determined to rescue the unhappy girl from the life of sin she was leading, and so at last he reluctantly consented. Brian, too, had objected, but ultimately yielded, as he saw that Madge had set her heart on it. Mother Guttersnipe objected at first, characterizing the whole affair as cussed humbug, but she likewise gave in, and Sal became maid to Miss Frettleby, who immediately set to work to remedy Sal's defective education by teaching her to read. The book she held in her hand was a spelling book, and this she handed to Madge. "I think I knows it now, miss," she said, respectfully, as Madge looked up with a smile. "Do you indeed?" said Madge gaily. "You will be able to read in no time, Sal." "Read this," said Sal, touching Tristan, a romance by Zoe. "Hardly," said Madge, picking it up with a look of contempt. "I want you to learn English and not a confusion of tongues like this thing. But it's too hot for lessons, Sal," she went on, leaning back in her seat, "so get a chair and talk to me." Sal complied, and Madge looked out at the brilliant flower beds, and at the black shadow of the tall elm which grew on one side of the lawn. She wanted to ask a certain question of Sal, and did not know how to do it. The moodiness and irritability of Brian had troubled her very much of late, and with the quick instinct of her sex, she ascribed it indirectly to the woman who had died in the back slum. Anxious to share his troubles and lighten his burden, she determined to ask Sal about this mysterious woman, and find out, if possible, what secret had been told to Brian which affected him so deeply. "Sal," she said, after a short pause, turning her clear gray eyes on the woman, "I want to ask you something." The other shivered and turned pale. About that?" Madge nodded. Sal hesitated for a moment, and then flung herself at the feet of her mistress. "I will tell you," she cried. "You have been kind to me, and have a right to know. I will tell you all I know." "Then," asked Madge, firmly, as she clasped her hands tightly together, "who was this woman whom Mr. Fitzgerald went to see, and where did she come from?" "Gran and me found her one evening in Little Burke Street," answered Sal, "just near the theater. She was quite drunk, and we took her home with us." "How kind of you," said Madge. "Oh, it wasn't that," replied the other dryly. "Gran wanted her clothes. She was awful swell dressed, and she took the clothes." "How wicked! Anyone would have done it down our way," answered Sal indifferently. But Gran changed her mind when she got her home. I went out to get some gin for Gran, and when I came back she was hugging and kissing the woman. She recognized her. Yes, I suppose so, replied Sal. And next morning, when the lady got square, she made a grab at Gran and hollered out, I was coming to see you. And then Gran chucked me out of the room, and they had a long jaw. And then, when I come back, Gran tells me the lady is a-going to stay with us 'cause she was ill, and sent me for Mr. White. And he came? Oh yes, often, said Sal. He kicked up a row when he first turned up, but when he found she was ill, he sent a doctor. But it warn't no good. She was 2 weeks with us, and then died the morning she saw Mr. Fitzgerald. I suppose Mr. White was in the habit of talking to this woman? Lots, returned Sal, but he always turned Gran and me out of the room before he started. And, hesitating, did you ever overhear one of these conversations? Yes, one, answered the other, with a nod. I got riled at the way he cleared us out of our own room, and once, when he shut the door and Gran went off to get some gin, I sat down at the door and listened. He wanted her to give up some papers, and she wouldn't. She said she'd die first, but at last he got him and took them away with him. Did you see them? Asked Madge, as the assertion of Gorby that White had been murdered for certain papers flashed across her mind. Rather, said Sal. I was looking through a hole in the door, and she takes M from under her pillar, and he takes M to the table, where the candle was, and looks at M. They were in a large blue envelope with writing on it in red ink. Then he put M in his pocket, and she sings out, You'll lose M. And he says, No, I'll always have M with me, and if he wants M, he'll have to kill me first afore he gets M. And you did not know who the man was to whom the papers were of such importance? No, I didn't. They never said no names. And when was it White got the papers? About a week before he was murdered, said Sal, after a moment's thought. And after that he never turned up again. She kept watching for him night and day, and 'cause he didn't come, got mad at him. I hear her saying, You think you've done with me, my gentleman, and leaves me here to die, but I'll spoil your little game. And then she wrote that letter to Mr. Fitzgerald, and I brought him to her, as you know. Yes, yes, said Madge, rather impatiently. I heard all that at the trial. But what conversation passed between Mr. Fitzgerald and this woman? Did you hear it? Bits of it, replied the other. I didn't split in court, 'cause I thought the lawyer would be down on me for listening. The first thing I heard Mr. Fitzgerald saying was, You're mad. It ain't true. And she yes. S'help me it is, White's got the proof. And then he sings out, My poor girl. And she yes. Will you marry her now? And yes, I will. I love her more than ever. And then she makes a grab at him and says, Spile his game if you can. And says he, What's your name? And she says, What? Asked Madge breathlessly. Rosanna Moore. There was a sharp exclamation as Sal said the name. And, turning round quickly, Madge found Brian standing beside her, pale as death, with his eyes fixed on the woman who had risen to her feet. Go on, he said sharply. That's all I know, she replied in a sullen tone. Brian gave a sigh of relief. You can go, he said slowly. I wish to speak with Miss Frettleby alone. Sal looked at him for a moment, and then glanced at her mistress, who nodded to her as a sign that she might withdraw. She picked up her book, and with another sharp, inquiring look at Brian, turned and walked slowly into the house. Thank you for listening to The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. If you enjoyed this part, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more classic stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, and let us know your favorite moment from this part. Stay tuned for the next installment. Coming soon. See you next time.